这是哪儿啊？哼，又忘了自己在干嘛。啊，在勘探这颗星球，还差一种生物，那差哪种生物呢？哎呦我操！你们干嘛一进来这么热烈欢迎我？我对配音没有特别要求，只有一个，就是如果你的游戏只能以第三人称进行，那你就要有配音。如果你的游戏可以第一，可以第三，无所谓。如果你的游戏只能第一人称，无所谓。我唯一的就是，如果你的游戏有第三人称，你必须有配音，别的都随便。就是只能第三人称的游戏。我对于像这种有没有配音都没什么问题。特别是对于主要第一人称的游戏。这小动物是什么呀？我上次记载的，咦，肯定是那种坐在就是那种小甲虫之类的玩意，绝对是，我操，这可太变态了。这种小东西。哎，有，看到了，甲虫，就是它，哇，真不容易，哈哈。开采这个也可以，我要记载这个东西。这是这个星球上的最后一个需要记载的，我们又要大功告成一个生态星球。加入到动物里，甲虫。这个则是，这是哪个星来着？啊，波江座 IV。腐动物，平和，代谢。冰封山脉，根叶林，可以非致命收获，没有其他特殊属性。波江座 IV， 这儿不可养殖。不过我们这个图并不代表完全准确的生物样貌，因为啊，它不同生物群系的样子是不一样的。然后你也不是每个星球都有比如说有的星球可能就只有沙漠，有的星球可能什么都有，所以每个星球上的物种会根据这些情况变化。就是不一样，就是不一样，颜色都不一样。还有大的，还有小的。之前我在同一个地方见到2种混的群，因为那个地方是生物群系的交界处，一个红的，一个蓝的。这边就是天仓5 VII， 我们捕捉到这只是这样子，但是在波江座 IV 是这样子。我们差最后一个地点， 就勘探完毕。这地点会是哪儿？我就发现玩这个游戏一边听那个 NASA 播客最好。对了，我要继续我的 NASA 播客。我 NASA 播客，就他这种播客说话的方式非常的不紧不慢，就特别舒服，让你听着心里特别的放松。上次我听到哪里了 ？Animation。不是，哎，怎么回到上一页呀？我靠，我把这个给去掉。上次听到哪儿了？上次我听到 music， 不对，上次 space mission，the people works Marlene 啊，上次听到这个，现在听 a matter of life and death， 生死之间。生死之事或者什么。
Since ancient times, volcanoes have been thought of as the realm of the gods. In some stories, explosive volcanic eruptions that sent rock and ash hurtling through the air were divine beings having a fight, and lava was their hot blood spilling on the ground. The word volcano comes from two of these ancient deities, Zeus Volcanos, a god of the Greek Isle of Crete, and Vulcan, the Roman fire god. These beliefs still linger today. During the recent eruptions of Hawaii's Kilauea volcano, people sang songs and left offerings to appease Pele, the temperamental goddess who's said to live in the volcano. Pele is described as both the destroyer and giver of life, and referred to as she who shapes the sacred land. And that's not far from the truth, but a truth based in geology rather than mythology. Volcanoes have been essential in shaping our world. Earth's land, atmosphere, and oceans are, to a great extent, the result of volcanoes. Volcanoes may even have played a vital role in the origin of life. Earth is a dynamic, living planet, thanks in large part to volcanoes. And did you know we're not the only place in the solar system that has them?
火山。
Start. 2, 1. Booster ignition. We are receiving heartbeat codes at this time. 0.7 meters a second. We've acquired the ground with the radar. We are wheels down on Mars.
Oh my God. This is amazing.
We're on a Mission, a podcast of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I'm Leslie Mullen, and this season we've been following the InSight mission to Mars. Like Earth, Mars has volcanoes. In fact, Mars has the largest volcano in the solar system. Named Olympus Mons, after Mount Olympus in Greece, where the gods were said to dwell, this Martian volcano is as wide as the state of Arizona and more than twice as tall as Mount Everest. But if you were standing at the foot of Olympus Mons, you shouldn't worry. Neither that nor any other volcano on Mars has erupted for millions of years. But why not? That's one of the questions the InSight mission hopes to answer. Sush Makar, Deputy Principal Scientist of the InSight mission, studies volcanoes.
I had a chance to go to Hawaii and Mount Etna and to Iceland, so I had a chance to go to several volcanoes over a period of about 10 years. Mount Etna is a place where they have eruptions where things spew out of the top and these rock bombs can come hurling out of the volcano to the surrounding area, but I was never there during that kind of eruption. I've never witnessed a super dangerous type of flow. The type of flows that we're studying don't move very quickly. I mean, yes, you can get hurt, but the flows that I've seen, they're predictable.
Even when a volcano is not erupting fire and brimstone, lava tubes deep underground burble and flow. The Infrasound Laboratory of the University of Hawaii records the sounds of this activity from volcanoes like Kilauea. They speed up and magnify the low-frequency recordings so we can hear them. Volcanoes are like pressure valves for the intense heat inside a
拿杯可
planet.
乐去。
Sue says this heat partly comes from radioactive elements deep underground.
The radiogenic elements, uranium, thorium, potassium, that lose heat as they decay to other elements over time. The bulk of a planet's energy actually comes from these radiogenic elements. They're bound up in the bits of rock. All rocky bodies have plenty of these elements. But it's really these radiogenic elements that are the engine of geology on any planet.
我现在玩的时候，我就想起以前玩辐射4那个聚落建造 mod 的时候，我就在旁边放各种电台，然后我玩天际线的时候，我就狂播那个城市设计、城市规划的那种视频和电台。玩星空就听 NASA， 我操，太对味了，就是这味。
And as we cooled down, Earth developed a crust. Volcanoes pocketed this fresh surface, expelling gases like carbon dioxide, water vapor, ammonia, and methane. The water vapor condensed into clouds, rain, and the oceans. The cooled crust of Earth, all the mountains and valleys and land around you, makes up only 1% of the planet. If Earth was an apple, the crust would be the thin apple skin. The apple pit is the planet's iron core, while the flesh of the apple is the hot mantle. The continents all sit on segments of the crust called tectonic plates. These plates move slowly over time, riding on convective heat currents in the mantle.
哎呦我靠！
When the plates move, the earth quakes.
在山上滑骨折。
Mountains rise, and continents drift.
On Earth, we know originally it was just a single plate. You know, your planet cools and you have an outer lithosphere. How did plate tectonics get started? How do we have this system of all these plates that are sliding around and creating all this deformation and all this activity in the surface of the Earth? Why is Earth the only place that has plate tectonics?
If planets like Earth all form the same way, then why are all the rocky planets so different? One answer to this question could be found in how much heat they have inside.
为什么其他岩石星就不像地球这样？
Planets are often described as heat engines. A heat engine converts heat energy into mechanical energy or motion. In a traditional car, for instance, when gasoline is combusted, heat from that reaction runs the engine. For a planet, the heat inside is what drives geology. It's kind of funny.
就是取决于行星内部的温度、热量，热量越高呢，反快活动就越频繁。 我肯定是这么计划，但能不能去那不是我说了算。
Cars like Mercury and Saturn are named after other planetary heat engines in our solar system.
A new way out. The thoroughly redesigned 250 horsepower Saturn V.
There also have been lesser-known cars named after Jupiter, Mars, and even Pluto. You can think about planets and moons being like different car models. For instance, I imagine Jupiter as an enormous tricked-out Hummer, dominating all the other planets, while Mercury is more like a sleek little sports car, making
扫描，然后弹出来哈德良萨农少校，我懵了一下。
One actual car recently entered this planetary Indy 500 race.
Amazing pictures from space. Elon Musk pulls off an engineering feat. He sent his own kind of rocket man on board a Tesla Roadster into orbit.
SpaceX launched
哦，这个是当时把那个特斯拉放到轨道里的时候。
their Falcon Heavy rocket. The convertible and its driver, a mannequin dressed in an astronaut suit and helmet, is now in orbit around the sun. JPL has a solar system dynamics group that keeps tabs on the orbits of all sorts of spacecraft, including the Roadster, as well as asteroids and other cosmic objects. Astronomers expect that if the car doesn't get torn to pieces by meteors and radiation, or crash into Mars or another planet or moon when it crosses their orbits, it could be zipping around our solar system for millions of years. The cherry red Roadster isn't running its engine, of course. The rocket launch gave it all the push it will ever need. When it comes to orange-red Mars, scientists wonder if the planet's heat engine has cooled into stillness. The dead volcanoes dotted across the Martian surface indicate it stalled out long ago. But to find out for sure, we need to peek under the hood and take its temperature, what scientists call a planet's heat flow. Sue has been wanting to check the heat flow of
零
Mars
下
for a
16
long
度
time.
About 25 years ago, is one of those ideas that I had in the shower morning. You know, it's like heat flow. That's a super important measurement, and I don't see many people working on how to do that on planets. So I'm gonna work on that. I'm gonna figure out how we might go about measuring heat flow. And I started working with some engineers here at JPL to come up with a way to do that for Mars. Our approach was to send penetrators. Our idea was to drop them off a spacecraft that's in orbit and have them hit the ground at 400 miles per hour. You know, these were devices that actually were developed initially by the military. They actually did things like deploy seismometers to listen for troop movement, that kind of thing. And people had begun to think about how we might use them in planetary science applications. So it seemed like the right approach because you get yourself under the ground, which is what you need to do on most bodies to measure the heat flow. We took our designs out to the Mojave Desert and rented airplanes and threw them out of the airplanes to see how they would penetrate and how they would survive once they get to the ground. So they each had their own little aeroshell. These were tiny. The aeroshell itself was only about a foot across. It went in like its own little spacecraft. Most spacecraft, they pop their aeroshell off before they hit the ground. We just shattered our aeroshell at impact. And then the penetrator inside, which again looks kind of like a nail, that would have just like gone through the aeroshell and kept going into the ground. The goal would have been to send a whole network of these things to Mars and potentially to other places. Because if you can build a dozen and send them for a relatively small price,
置换
use a
毒
few,
素营
that's
养
okay.
代谢
Sue was part of a team that put penetrators on the Mars Polar Lander mission. The two penetrators were named Deep Space 2, but they were also known as the Mars microprobes, and they were designed to detach from the Mars Polar Lander spacecraft just as it entered the Martian atmosphere. The penetrators presumably separated from the spacecraft and then plunged down, hitting the surface of Mars hard enough to pierce the ground. But we'll never know for sure because instead of relaying data back to Earth, we never heard from them again.
Yes, Jim Hill from CNN. Can you think of a single scenario that would account for the failure of communication with both the probes and the lander?
You mean a single thing that would cause both of them to have occurred? Not separating, the cruise stage not separating would be the only one.
And do you know for a fact it did separate?
No, we do not.
Mars Polar Lander was one of a series of Mars missions in the 1990s that didn't make it to the planet intact. A reminder of just how dangerous going to Mars really is.
I think we'd all been up for about 2 days straight, waiting and hoping to hear a signal come back. Yeah, it was very sad. Of course, it was just very devastating to have spent, 5 years of your life working on this and have it just stop talking to you. And so now we have a lot more information about how spacecraft go into the atmosphere. So they send back all these tones like, yep, did this step, yep, did this step. It's hard to communicate a lot because they're moving so fast and it's a short time period.
森林你根本找不到地方让
After
飞船
that
降落，我还是回去
disaster, we have designed in much more information. In case something goes wrong, we'll know what went wrong and how to fix it. So that was one of the big frustrations too, because we just didn't know what happened, and so we don't do things that way anymore. When things go beautifully, it looks easy, but it's really not easy. Any kind of
哎，降水
exploration
里
is not
也不是不行，就降这
easy
儿
or guaranteed ever. That was a bad year for Mars, but if you look
冻
at
结
the
液
history
体，
of
但飞船
exploration,
应该没事儿。
there are many disasters along the way to those fabulous discoveries. So if you're going to be in the business, you have to pick yourself up and keep going ahead.
Sue and her colleagues have been waiting almost 20 years for another chance to measure the heat flow of Mars. And now with the InSight mission, they've got one. But this time, rather than crash penetrators into Mars, InSight will drill down below the surface. The InSight team refers to their drill as the mole.
Moles, the creatures, burrow themselves under the ground, right? So that's where the name comes from. It's really a burrowing device.
The mole is part of a larger instrument package called HP Cubed. That's an acronym with 1 H and 3 Ps, and it stands for Heat Flow and Physical Properties Package. It was provided by the German Space Agency. Troy Hudson is a JPL engineer who has been collaborating with the German team on HP Cubed.
HP Cubed is going to go deeper than we have ever gone on any object besides Earth. The maximum depth that HP Cubed can achieve is 5 meters. It's about 16 feet. And it does this in order to get below temperature disturbances at the surface. There's daily and seasonal fluctuations.
要降湖里了。
Essentially noise, as far as we're concerned. They mask the signal.
这是唯一可以降落的地方哈。
So we have to dig down below that level in order to make the key measurements we need to get at the heat flow. A critical component of HP Cubed is called the mole. The mole is a drill, but it looks more like a pile driver or a self-hammering nail, we can call it. It's about the diameter of a quarter. It's about as long as your forearm. And it has inside it a mechanism that winds up a hammer against a spring and releases it. The outside is smooth and has no moving parts. All of the parts are on the inside. And it winds up this hammer and that smacks down onto the interior surface of the mole and drives it another millimeter into the ground. So millimeter by millimeter at a very slow pace. Each hammer stroke happens about once every 4 seconds. So that's something like this. We're very constrained on most space missions with mass and power. And so what we've done is we've traded the power of the mole strokes for time. We're not in a rush to get deep. We don't have to do it in a day or even a week. So we can use a very powerful but low power motor to wind up that hammer against those very strong springs and release it. So bit by bit, it knocks its way into the subsurface. We go about 50 centimeters at a time. So that's a very slow and stately pace where the mole penetrates into the ground, pulling behind it a scientific tether. The tether provides power and data to the mole and also has temperature sensors, which allow it to measure one critical component of heat flow. Another critical component is thermal conductivity, and that's something the mole measures as it makes its way down. Those strokes happening about once every 4 seconds, probably going to take around 6,000 or 8,000 of those to get to our final depth. But of course, that depends on the properties of the soil that we encounter on Mars.
This isn't the first time we've sent a drilling mission to outer space.
It hits. A meteor shower. This new one you're tracking.
I fixed something up for you.
It's what we call a global killer. Nothing would survive, not even bacteria.
The United States government just asked us to save the world. Anybody want to say no?
对，这门现在是。
No, not that drilling mission. As depicted in the movie Armageddon, a mission to drill into an asteroid hasn't happened yet, but drills have been used beyond Earth before. Sush Makar explains.
The first time on another planet where we measured heat flow, it was with a drill, and we had it was on the moon. Apollo astronauts had a drill, and they went out there and drilled holes into the moon and put temperature sensors down below the surface. We don't have astronauts on Mars, so we have to do it in a different way. And it's actually super hard to drill a very deep hole robotically. You can't take a 15-foot drill on our spacecraft to Mars. No, you would have to assemble it into bits once you got there. So all that stuff is tricky to do in terms of a regular drill.
The Curiosity rover currently operating on Mars has a drill, but it can drill down to, at most, a few inches. As Troy said, the drill for InSight is meant to burrow down as far as 16 feet. A visit to any big city makes drilling seem like a simple, if noisy, routine task. But as Sue mentioned, it's not so easy to have a robot rather than a person operate a drill. Also, engineers had to design a drill to work on a planet with a very different environment from Earth.
For the mole, one of the challenges is testing it in a Mars-like condition.
哇，你这个你这怎么是红的？我操，这个气。
materials that we think simulate the soil on Mars quite well. And we were also able to create the same pressure, atmospheric pressure on Mars, which is about 1/100th of the pressure on the surface of the Earth. We created the same
中丝，
temperatures
我操，
as we
没见
expect
这
in some
鲜
surface
红
of
色，
Mars,
我操
and we even created a
！Holy
thermal
shit！
gradient that's similar to what we expect from the heat flow. So we made it as Mars-like
我都
as
没
we
见
possibly
过
could.
像
And
这星系我都没
we
见过，
brought the
藏哪
mole
去了？靠！
from one of the early designs for the mole
真
from
他妈
Germany
没
over here
见
to
过
test
这
it
个。
under Mars conditions, and got a very big surprise when we
我们去 A，
first tested it in the tank under Mars pressure and temperature. Instead of hammering forward to go under the surface, the mole started to hammer backwards, which was not what we
这儿
expected or wanted to see.
Instead of drilling its way down into the soil, the mole kept popping itself up and out. The problem turned out to be the very low air pressure of the Mars simulation tank, which didn't damp out the recoil of the mole's vibration.
If you're fired a rifle or something, you know that there's a recoil. Basically, when you have that momentum going forward, there's a pushback. And it's the same with our little hammering mechanism or in a jackhammer. We discovered that our mole was not going to be able to push itself into the ground with that design. We had to modify it slightly. So basically, there are kind of like 3 moving parts within the hammering mechanism, and they really had to adjust the distribution of mass. In the end, it ended up being a relatively small adjustment, but a really important one.
After all that work to design what is
这星系有点
basically
发
a
绿，
planetary thermometer,
可能是因为
InSight will
金
use
属
it to take Mars's
的颜色。
temperature.
But it's kind of crazy because you do all this work and you get literally one number. And you know, it's great because we have so much information about Mars that we have the ability to really interpret that number in a very meaningful way. But it's just so different than most experiments, where you are constantly taking pictures, or you're getting different seismic events, or
所以其实岩石和贫瘠的区别是不是说，
dust devils or something?
其实就是岩石星球不是贫瘠星球也是岩石星球，只是贫瘠星球是贫瘠的岩石星球，是这意思。
So by measuring the heat coming out of the inside of the planet today, we can estimate just how much of that energy Mars has, and we can kind of extrapolate backwards in time to the very beginning of when Mars formed. And so we can kind of have this estimate of how the amount of energy has changed over time.
Knowing how Mars's energy has changed over time can give us a little window into what Mars was like in the past. Bruce Banner,
有一个特征哎，火山口怀疑是火山
says
活
the
动。
temperature measurement also could help figure out
降落。
whether Mars has underground lakes of water today. For instance, InSight could help confirm a recent finding made by the European Space Agency's Mars Express satellite that indicated there could be liquid water under the base of Mars's south polar ice cap.
The possibility for there being liquid water at the base of the polar cap depends on what the temperature is down there. It has to be warm enough for the water to melt. What InSight should be able to do is to get an idea of how much heat's flowing out of the inside of Mars, which can lead us to be able to calculate, you know, the likely temperatures at the base of the polar cap, and that would help to figure out whether it's plausible that this is liquid water.
If Mars is warm enough underground to have liquid water, rather than frozen solid ice, that's not only good news for future explorers who need a source of water,
对 For
it also
Mankind 的
increases
都好久
the
没
odds
看
that Mars could have life.
因为它每季集更新搞得我很不耐烦，我就想连着看，等它更完再看算了，我先看我的双峰阵。
think life on Earth originated from the interaction between volcanoes and liquid water at volcanic vents at the bottom of the sea. Although it's still an open question, the combination of volcanic energy, vent minerals, and water would seem to provide all the ingredients needed for life to arise. InSight's ability to determine whether Mars's heat engine is still running and therefore has the potential for liquid water and even life depends on the HB-cubed mole working and burrowing down to the right depth. Troy Hudson explains.
The mole is not infallible. It can be stopped by an unfortunately sized or shaped rock in the subsurface. We're landing at a location where there are very few rocks on the surface, and we have many indications that we've got quite a distance of broken up ground to dig through with very few.
是我的错觉吗？
Nonetheless,
还是怎么样？还是这个星球的灰色看上去有点青色？哎，不是我的错觉吧？你看， 你看这个确实是青色的，这不是我的错觉吗？哎，为什么我在我的 iPad 屏幕上看不出来啊？但是我这里就是我的屏幕上这边是青色的，这个石头不是纯。但你看这个星球表面，它就是发青色的。我感觉是有一点。
Next time on a mission.
We call ourselves the grave diggers on Mars.
不是，我觉得越
It was an exciting mission because the lander was going to die.
我不记得在别的地方看到过这种发青的。
So it was a race against time.
If you'd like to check on the Tesla Roadster's location in the solar system, visit the Horizons webpage at ssd.jpl.nasa.gov/horizons.cgi. We'll also include the web address and instructions on how to use the Horizons interface on our website, mars.nasa.gov/insight. If you like this podcast, please subscribe, rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and share us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We're on a mission, a podcast of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
是火流星雨。到现在还没把这个背出来，是不是有点离谱？就看到这个不知道它外边叫什么，还要回去检查一下。我感觉我是这个地方只有极端太阳辐射，但是你探了这么久，应该记得了吧？背出来了。这个不能叫半宜居，这个叫怎么说呢？只能说它不宜居，但是。不是这个，之前有个行星，它不是人类不能住，但是也有别的生物，那这种应该叫什么呀？半宜居行吧。有生命、有大气、有水，但是这些都不符合人类，就叫半宜居。所有全部符合人类才叫宜居。就是说，你在星球表面不需要穿宇航服，不需要戴头盔，那就叫那个就是黄金世界。我后面做了这么一个标签了，应该。那你下面这个上面有动物是不是应该是半宜居？我帮你改。这颗星球我改14A， 哎，它配的图是宇航员。每次它自动配宇航员的时候，我就觉得特别有意思。你多配点星球图片吧，干脆。
Greetings, Captain. I will see you at a later time.
我说怎么这么安静了呢？我的播客播完，下一个 Ski Robots lend a hand， 讲机器人的了。瓦斯科讲你的，瓦斯科，来听。
Should I contact the ground station?
The International Space Station flies 250 miles above our heads, circling the Earth once every 90 minutes. The size of a football field, a lot of work goes into keeping this high-tech research center running. Astronauts on the space station have various robot helpers to lend them a hand.
Robot helpers.
One of these robots is actually a large arm on the outside of the station.
机械臂，是加拿大臂吗？
The robot arm moves large equipment.
有一个有名的叫加拿大臂。
Because the robot arm was built by Canada's space agency,
Canada
it's known as the Canada arm.
就是这，提前剧透。
Houston, we have a podcast.
Canada
talked about the
天宫上有个更先进的，现在好像我不知道装没装上去。我之前看到有个更先进的，它还能在外面爬，就是它两边都是，就是它的那个手臂可以接到就是这个手臂拍到另一个地方对接好以后，另一边可以起来，就是它可以在空间天宫那个可以在空间站外面爬，更狠。
then has to be taken out at the other end of the motion.
You gotta stop, yeah.
Otherwise, the station's orientation would have to adjust to that.
You don't do it right.
地平线防卫武器
You could flip the station over.
As difficult and cool as it is to operate a giant robot arm in space, the technology has been helpful down here on Earth.
It's possible to do very, very fine, even microscopic surgery with versions of robotic arms. And the technology that that's based on, as it turns out, is directly derived from the work that we've done on Space Station with Canadarm2. And it's not even just the physicality of it, it is the technology of controlling coordinated motion in very refined ways. Because, you know, we humans, if you reduce everything to a small enough scale, it's actually difficult to control things that precisely. But the robot, if you gear everything down, the robot can really help you with that.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, if your hands may not tremble, but when you're at the micron level, your hand's really trembling and you're not even aware of it.
Yeah.
But that's the level of control that they're able to provide with these microscopic brain surgery robots. And that's really helping people, and that's exciting.
Start, 2, 1, booster ignition. We are receiving heartbeat codes. 0.7 meters a second. We've acquired the ground with the radar. We are wheels down.
哇，我那瓦斯科手办什么时候到？好像要好久，还有好像年末才能出。
We're on a Mission, a podcast of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. I'm Leslie Mullen. This season is all about the InSight mission to Mars. Like the International Space Station, the InSight lander has a robotic arm. The robot arm is also tricky to use, and as we'll hear later, it's led to joint benefits for folks back here on Earth. But today's story is not just about InSight's robot arm. It's also about the person in charge of building it.
My name is Ashte Trebi Olenu, and I'm the Instrument Deployment Systems lead on InSight.
InSight's robotic arm is called the Instrument Deployment System because its job is to take scientific instruments off of the InSight lander and put them on the ground. There are also cameras on the arm to help it see what it's doing. Having this arm perform its task correctly is crucial because if the instruments aren't placed on the ground, InSight won't be able to achieve its mission.
The goal of InSight is to understand how terrestrial planets are formed. To understand how terrestrial planets are formed, you have to go and look deep beneath the surface. You have to look at the core of the planet. When I talk to kids, they say, wow, you guys are going to dig all the way to the core? And I said, no, we're just going to do an old-fashioned medical checkup, right? You go to your doctor, they have the stethoscope, they put it around your chest or your back or your lungs, and then they read your pulses. And then what do? They take your temperature. So InSight is going to do that. InSight is going to take the heartbeat of Mars. So for the doctor to be able to do that, the doctor obviously needs a hand to grab his stethoscope or his thermometer. The doctor needs eyes to know where to place it. And this is what the instrument deployment system is. The instrument deployment system on InSight is the hand of the doctor, the arm of the doctor, the fingers of the doctor, and the eyes of the doctor.
Ashite has come a long way to get to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, also known as JPL. One of JPL's other nicknames is the Center of the Universe, because JPL coordinates radio signals to and from all space missions beyond the moon through connected antennas called the Deep Space Network. Ashite came to the center of the universe from what could be considered the center of the Earth. He grew up in Accra, Ghana, in Africa.
The British Meridian, or zero longitude, runs right through Ghana. So Ghana is not in the Western Hemisphere or the Eastern Hemisphere. It's right in the middle and just above the equator. Ghana is a cross between, I want to say, a country in the Caribbean and the Amazon rainforest. Very beautiful, long white beaches along the Atlantic coast. And the castles and forts in Ghana are older than what you find in the United States. They're castles and forts from the Danish, from the Portuguese, from the Dutch, every country, because Ghana used to be the gold coast. There was gold all over. And as you move from the coast to the inland, you find rainforest. So you move from beautiful coast beaches to rainforest, from rainforest to savanna, because as you get further north, you're approaching the Sahara Desert. So it covers it all.
Stay here forever.
So one of my uncles, Justice Niamolin, he became acting president a few times, and he was the Speaker of Parliament during the Second Republic of Ghana.
For the people of the Gold Coast, there came last week a day that will always be remembered in their history. For here, in what's been a British colony for more than a century, nearly 1 million people went to the polls in their first general election. The main issue in the election lay between those who want self-government sometime in the future and those who want it now, like the Convention People's Party, the CPP. Their leader, Kwame Nkrumah, spent election day in jail, serving a sentence for incitement and sedition.
So when Ghana gained independence from the British in 1957, the Queen was the head of state, and we had a Prime Minister, Kwame Nkrumah. So during the transition, Ghana became a republic 3 years after that.
Leaders from east and west came to Accra to see the handover. Vice President Nixon represented the United States. He arrived with a delegation that included civil rights leader Martin Luther King.
A new order is coming into being, and an old order is passing away. It seems to me that this is quick testimony to the fact that eventually the forces of justice triumph in the universe, and somehow the universe itself is on the side of freedom and justice.
Kwame Nkrumah became the president, and during those times, you had the Cold War, you had the East-West struggle, and the government at that time was leaning a little bit east, and there was the first coup d'etat in Africa to overthrow the government, replace the military government.
The Redeemer, the Savior, is now the fallen idol. Newspaper headlines report the spectacular overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah. And jubilant crowds celebrate his downfall in the streets of Accra.
And then subsequently there were elections for the Second Republic. And my uncle's party won, and my uncle became the Speaker of Parliament. Then he became acting president during the absence of the president. He was a very well-known justice. If you go into the history of Ghana laws, most cases will cite his cases. Or if you go to law school in Ghana, you see a lot of cases that is based on precedents of what he's done. So he's very prominent in that sense. When I was a teenager, I spent a lot of time with my uncle. He had already retired by then, but he was writing of the laws of the
Fuck! 我在那里勘探扫描星球瓦鲁人直接开始干了。哇，你们这帮，人家是在搞科学研究，你们这帮人。
I was brought up in a family that took civic responsibility very seriously. We would volunteer to do things, just help other people in need. We had a volunteer organization. My dad was an economist, my mom was a teacher. My dad formed associations to help towns to mobilize themselves to be able to solve their own problems. Everybody in my family leaned a lot more towards the art and law. I leaned more towards the kind of standard.
Accept your suffering, heathen.
When I was growing up, our house was very close to the international airport, so I always saw planes coming in and out, and I was always fascinated by them. So I usually knew the schedule of all the planes, right? So back then we had British Caledonia, now British Airways, and I knew Pan Am, when Pan Am was going to land, when it was going to take off. I just memorized all the different schedule for the planes that I could tell the different type of planes, Boeing 747, Boeing 737, and all the Aeroflot, and all the Russian planes as well. So I had a Pan Am little model, because I think my dad flew Pan Am and then they gave him a model. I always wanted to go to England to do my aerospace. When I was in secondary school, 12 to 14 years old, I used to write to British Aerospace, and they sent me posters of the Harrier. I was very fascinated by the Harrier aircraft. That's an aircraft that could take off vertically and lands vertically. It's one of the cool British inventions. So I got a lot of posters of it in my bedroom, and I used to read about it. I used to write. Those days you write letters, right? And they send you a whole brochure about it. I was very fascinated by that kind of technology.
Achete's dream to study aerospace in England came true, and he traveled far from his home country. But in some ways, England felt very familiar.
Culturally, it wasn't a shock because Ghana was a former British colony. The language of instruction in school was English. That's the official language of Ghana is English. There are about 14 other dialects, at least, but English is the medium of communication. So most of the TV shows that we watch were all from England. So in that sense, it wasn't different. And in terms of studying, it wasn't different because we had the same syllabus. I took my advanced level from the University of London, so we do the same test. But obviously, the weather was different. You have low clouds, rain, what the British call bad light. And, you know, you have to use the train, you have to use the metro. And so there were things that were quite different in that sense.
快乐球，我操！图鉴快乐球。
Queen Mary College University of London. I was very much interested in those days what we used to call the glass cockpit. That is where we automate.
我在这好的科考了，他们一个接一个要干我，我容易吗？我真的。
I majored in avionics, and then so I went straight to my PhD to do controls, basically automation for missiles and autopilots and vehicles, underwater vehicles.
After getting his PhD.
是啊，这波江座可比较接近中心，全是人，密密麻麻，敌人友军都很多。
At Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, I applied control techniques to a DARPA project that was basically multiple autonomous vehicles doing surveillance and reconnaissance for those days. It was the Bosnian War, where they wanted to put these robots on the streets to avoid snipers, to be able to figure out where the snipers are. We developed that technology for a while, so I joined JPL in 1999. To work on multi-robot systems. So I've always been interested in space. When I was a kid, I always been fascinated by the moon. So I usually stand on my porch and clear the different things. Start here. And I was fortunate that I live very close to the center of Accra, where we have most of the embassies, like the U.S. Embassy. And they usually have a weekly newsreel that you can go in and then watch the news from the Voice of America or from the BBC. So I saw a little bit about the moon landings and documentaries.
Good evening. The first men on the moon lifted off on the first stage of their journey home an hour and 6 minutes ago. The Stars and Stripes flies proudly now over the Sea of Tranquility. A new chapter in human history has opened. The race for the moon is over. Man's probe into the universe has begun.
JPL and NASA were interested in what
哎，这边还说 Man's probe into the universe has begun， 就是登月，然后就再也没有人登。
Infrastructure for humans, because the human time is very precious, right? So when they get
以为那是第一步，实际上是最后一步。最后一次有人踏上。不过他这边说的是第一次登月的事。反正意思就是说，自从那阿波罗系列任务以后，就再也没有。大家当时还认真的都以为是迈向星空的第一步，马上就要全面进发了，结果再也没有。
Although his first NASA project didn't work out, over the years, Ashiday has been able to send his robots to Mars 4 times. One of the missions he worked on, the Mars Phoenix lander, also had a robot arm. The arm had a big scoop at the end of it to dig into the soil near the Martian North Pole and then transfer that soil to instruments on the lander for testing. Ashiday was part of the team operating the arm.
We're going to do experimentation to dig and look at icy soil materials.
有一种稀有矿物不知道在哪。
The soil composition. We're very fortunate to be one of 5 people to be able to dig ice on the planet. You know, we call ourselves the grave diggers on Mars. So it was an exciting mission because the lander was going to die because we only had a year because winter was coming in, right? So it was a race against time. So we landed and we had to work very fast. We had a lot of excitement because we know from orbital data that if we dig 5 centimeters, we're going to see ice. And below and behold, we could see the icy material. It was a lot of fun and it was really exciting. A lot of discovery, a lot of challenges, you know. As you know, with planetary exploration, not everything works. So we had challenges with our instrument, but we were able to persevere and fight it to the very end.
Many parts for InSight are the same as for Phoenix, but the arm for InSight actually comes from a mission called Mars Surveyor 2001, also known as Mars 01.
Mars 01 was cancelled, and they had a flight robotic arm sitting in the warehouse. I think of the arm as a pre-used car, but not that used. But the challenge here is that Mars 01 was built on the NASA philosophy of faster, better, cheaper. So that means you skipped a few steps to make things a little bit faster and to make things a little bit cheaper. And InSight is working in the new regime where we're more rigorous in our processes. So the challenge is, how do you take something from a different era and make it compliant to the current system? So there are a few things we've changed on the arm for InSight. So first of all, the links of the arm, which are the upper arm and forearm tubes, we've replaced them with titanium. They used to be composite.
Hi.
We've also kind of taken the actuators and cleaned them up and re-lubricate them. We've replaced the camera. We've put in a new scoop, and then we've put in, most important thing, a grapple.
The robot arm for Mars 01 had been designed to pick up a little toaster oven-sized rover off the lander and place it on the ground. InSight's robot arm has a similar task. It will pick up 3 scientific instruments off the lander and place them on the ground. Despite the seeming simplicity of this task, robots actually aren't that good at picking things up. In fact, developing a robot hand has been one of the biggest challenges in robotics. Robotic designers have made hands in different ways, from more human-looking hands with a palm and fingers to grippers that look like various tools. In the 2017 Amazon Robotics Challenge, robots had to sort items like bottles, toys, and sponges and place them in boxes. The winning team had a hand resembling the Claw Crane arcade game. The hand on the end of InSight's arm, called the grapple, also resembles a claw crane.
The grapple is something that you see in the arcade, where you take your kids and then they're trying to pick those teddy bears and they usually fall out of the grapple. This grapple wouldn't do that. This grapple is really good. Once you pick up something, it's not going to let go until you tell it explicitly to let go. I don't think the people in the arcade will like our grapple. They're not going to make any money.
The grapple's 5-fingered hand opens by melting wax, the same kind of wax used in candles and crayons. Nick Haddad, one of the engineers who worked on the grapple, explains.
It uses a wax actuator to open the fingers. It's actually a thoroughly proven technology. It's used in space applications like the InSight grapple, but it's also used for decades in things like our car thermostats and our appliances at home. It uses a heater to melt some wax inside of a little housing, and when this wax melts, it expands and it develops this hydraulic pressure, and that pressure pushes out a rod which we use to actuate our mechanism.
To get the fingers to close again, you just need to switch off the heater. As the wax cools, it contracts and causes the fingers to tighten their grip. The first instrument the robot arm and grapple will need to place on the ground is a seismometer, which will be used to detect Marsquakes. Here's Ashitey again.
This seismometer is tethered to the lander. We first image where we
land.
The scientists can pick exactly where they want to put this instrument to get the right measurement, just like a doctor does. The doctor tries to put it on your heart or your lungs, somewhere to get the right information. Once they've done that, my team, with the rest of the mission operations team, built a set of sequences to pick up the seismometer, peel the tether that links it to the lander to send data and power back and forth, and put it on the surface. The seismometer is very, very sensitive. If a butterfly lands on it, it flaps its wings, it's going to detect it. So the winds of Mars and the temperature fluctuations will swamp the signal of the sensors. So what we have is we have a heat shield, what we call a wind and thermal shield. So this wind and thermal shield is a big dish that we're going to pick up and then put it on top of the seismometer. Once we've done with that, we have to take the temperature of Mars. We have an instrument, a mold, which is basically a self-hammering nail that will hammer itself up to 5 meters into the ground. And behind it is got a tether with thermocouples that will take the temperature of Mars for a year. Combining these two, seismometer and heat flow, we can tell you something about the core of Mars, the materials of the core, the mantle, and the crust. We're doing all this blindfolded, hundreds of million miles away. So the other way you can think of this deployment is like, you have a fish pole with an instrument at the end of it, and you want to put it within the location.
波江做的生态星球这么多。
Growing up in Ghana, Ashitey
这是我
never
目前
dreamed
遇到的
someday
生
he'd
态
be
最密
operating
集的星
robots
系
on Mars. His
波
work
江。
for NASA and JPL has led him to also become involved with FIRST, an
波江
organization
作物
which holds
哦，
robotics
没有，这个没有
competitions
生
for
命，但是
students.
它有大气和有水，而且有
We
水。
supported first robotics in Southern California, so I participated in it for 2 or 3 years. And I could see how that was kind of helpful to middle school and high school kids. So I took the same concept and I went to Ghana and I formed the Ghana Robotics Academy Foundation with the help of the State Department and the U.S. Embassy in Ghana. and it's based on FIRST. And the goal there is to connect science theory to practice. Most people in the developing world or in very low socioeconomic status don't have the necessary resources to be able to do experimentation. They see science as very remote. They don't see it in their everyday life. So what we've done is the robotics clubs in most of the schools now, and we also allow private teams. So if you're in a religious organization.
Some of these students may well be the future of African-led missions in space, but a step at a time. First, building robots out of Lego blocks and programming them to navigate through a maze using light and sound is a chance for them to connect scientific theory with hands-on learning to fix real problems.
So we've been going for about 7 years now. We started in 2011, and every region of Ghana has a club or have schools, and we have competitions throughout. And we'll be able to send teams to the World Robotic Olympiad, to the RoboFest, and to many international events that they've done very well. Also, we usually encourage a lot of girls. So we have more girls teams than boys teams. We have more girls teams winning the competition. And you go and talk to kids that are not really interested in school and they're interested in science. As soon as they start building, they start connecting theory to practice, some light bulb goes off in their head and their grades improve. And we've seen that from the statistics that as kids participate, their rate of engagement goes high in class and their attention span because they can see the usefulness of what you're doing in class. And not having that connection, I think, is a disservice to a lot of kids. We try to take things that you're learning in school. A very simple one is the equation of a line. Most people say, why do I need an equation of a line? And we take that and we can show them you can build a robot that can follow a line. And this is what is done in the Amazon warehouses, where the robots follow the lines and then pick up the things, and we can show them, well, this is what people are doing in real life. This is how you can take the theory you're learning and use it to develop new technologies to make things work and help your society.
Next time on a mission.
The spacecraft is set to turn off at a certain time. So we got messages down from Wally saying, yeah, I'm leaking, I've got to go now. I'll talk to you in 8 hours. And it's like, oh man.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe, rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and share us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We're On a Mission, a podcast of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
阿基拉星谁动了？靠！我动了阿基拉星。Wonder.
Come watch right with me tonight. In 1985, the talking teddy bear Teddy Ruxpin took the world by storm.
My name is Teddy Ruxpin. Can you and I be friends?
Teddy Ruxpin had a cassette tape player in his back. The cassettes made for the toy were special because while the left track of the tape held the audio recording, the right track contained data commands to move Teddy's mouth and eyes.
All he does is tell stories about friendship, caring, sharing. And he goes on adventures where the only thing he captures
I would like you to meet some of
the
child's
imagination.
We're going to have lots of good times.
This animatronic toy was seen as a marvel and made a fortune for the manufacturer, Worlds of Wonder. Teddy Ruxpin's inventor, Ken Forsey, had been working on the toy's concept long before it became a success. In the late 1950s, it was going to be a puppet, and instead of a teddy bear, it was going to be a monkey named Simeon Greep, in honor of NASA's space program. At the time, NASA was sending monkeys into space to see how they tolerated spaceflight before launching the first human astronauts.
Let's go to far-off places and search for treasures.
应该有沙尘暴。
The success of Teddy Ruxpin was short-lived. Competing toy makers put out their own talking dolls, and when the stock market crashed in 1987, Worlds of Wonder went bankrupt and sold off their assets. Around the same time, NASA was putting together a mission to Mars, and the group in charge of building its camera needed nearly 2,000 computer chips. The rumor goes that they purchased AT&T computer memory chips originally intended for Teddy Ruxpin dolls.
You do understand the simple basics of aerodynamics, don't you?
Huh?
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, boost ignition. We are receiving heartbeat codes time. 0.7 meters a second. We've acquired the ground with the radar. We are wheels down on Mars.
Oh my God. This is amazing.
We Are on a Mission, a podcast of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. I'm Leslie Mullen, and this season we've been following the InSight spacecraft on its journey to Mars. This episode is about how technology can take you to unexpected places, how something invented for one purpose can often end up being used for something quite different. There's a lot more to that Teddy Ruxpin story, but I'll tell you about it at the end of this episode. An example of an unexpected use of technology for the InSight mission is a pair of small satellites. Bruce Banner, lead scientist on InSight, explains.
There's a technology demonstration called MARCO, which stands for Mars Cube 1, and that's a pair of CubeSats, which are little tiny satellites. They're about the size of a briefcase, and they're going to fly along with us to Mars.
NASA often sends new technologies along with space missions just to see how they fare. For InSight, the MARCO technology demonstration is an add-on. The mission doesn't rely on these CubeSats. The point is to piggyback on a more standard mission to test out how new technology performs in the harsh environment of outer space. Tech demos like MARCO are like a space engineer's version of play.
Compared to a big spacecraft like InSight, it's almost like a garage project, just a handful of scientists and engineers, building these things in their own little laboratory. It's a way to get relatively cheap access to space.
For MARCO, the big test is to see how far these small satellites can go.
We already have hundreds of CubeSats going into orbit around the Earth, and we're trying to sort of stretch that into interplanetary space, and so this is our first attempt to see how that's going to work.
MARCO launched on the same rocket as the InSight lander. InSight was on the front of the rocket, while the two MARCO satellites were in the back.
And they're actually in a little sort of suitcase container at the back end, so they kind of fly in luggage. And after we separate from the rocket, they actually push off to each side of our trajectory, and we fly to Mars, not separated very much, but they fly by themselves. They have their own propulsion system, they have their own battery system and power system, and they have some radios. And if they do work well, and if they go all the way to Mars, they'll actually be able to relay the radio signal from InSight as it's landing through the atmosphere of Mars and give us possibly one of the first signals that we're getting back from InSight.
Mars landers can talk directly to Earth, but the amount of information they can send that way is extremely limited. The bulk of their signals are instead sent up to satellites orbiting in the Martian sky above. Those satellites grab the lander's signals and then toss them to us. Think of it as a space-age game of baseball.
活动断层
If InSight is the pitcher, then MARCO will be up at bat just as InSight enters the Martian atmosphere. Radio satellite dishes on Earth are the players on the field, waiting to catch the ball. If MARCO works, we'll get the information about InSight's landing on Mars right as it's happening. But if MARCO swings and misses, it's okay. We'll get that baseball of data a few hours later from the designated catcher, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. This satellite orbiting Mars will be setting on the horizon as InSight lands, so we'd have to wait until it swings back around the planet before it can toss us the ball. CubeSats are simple metal boxes with humble origins. First launched in the early 2000s, those CubeSats were school projects. Here's Andy Klesch, chief engineer for MARCO.
Originally, they started as a way to get students involved in space exploration. Take extra mass that was available on the launch vehicle, put it in a box so that we had a standardized payload, and students could build up different experiments, prove out technology, show that they could understand the space environment. And eventually, they've actually gone beyond that to do commercial opportunities with these, provide real science missions around the Earth. Well, in the 2010s, 2011, we started to ask, what can we do with these small platforms away from Earth to explore the broader solar system area?
CubeSats that orbit Earth can use our planet's magnetic field to keep themselves oriented. They're small enough and light enough that that little push is all they need. But for CubeSats going beyond Earth, engineers had to come up with a propulsion system. Propulsion systems work in space due to Newton's third law of motion. Every action produces an equal and opposite reaction. The backward thrust of exhaust pushes the spacecraft forward. Cody Colley is the mission manager for Marco.
No one had made a propulsion system that small for that kind of dedicated purpose. VACO, which makes valves for the biggest of spacecrafts, started building these cold gas propulsion systems, and that's what we ended up flying as a cold gas system. And the really cool thing about our propellant is that it's actually fire extinguisher propellant. It's the same liquid in your common fire extinguisher. We have one extra step there where if we just fired it just like a fire extinguisher, it'd be gone all at once. And we wouldn't be able to very precisely control our trajectory. So we send it to a staging area where it goes down to lower pressure. If you were to see it, it's like a little tiny puff. Instead of this big explosive thing of a, well, not explosive, hopefully, but a fire extinguisher going up is a little bit more dramatic than what you would see out of the CubeSat fire.
A fire extinguisher has essentially two components: a substance for fighting fire and a propellant that makes the firefighting substance come out when you press the handle. Because the propellant is stored at high pressure, fire extinguisher canisters are made of strong metal to prevent them from exploding.
One of the key things about the Marco design in particular to mitigate even that low pressure from ever becoming a problem is that the propulsion system would leak before it ever burst. So if we ever had a high pressure event, it'd be a sad day for us. It would leak all of its propellant, but it would not blow up in the traditional sense. And that's important. Our number one requirement on Marco out the door is do no harm.
The fire extinguisher propulsion system inspired nicknames for the two CubeSats. Here's Andy Klesch again.
Wally and Eva are really our nicknames for the two Marco spacecraft. Officially, they are named Marco A and Marco B. And as you know from the Disney movie, Wally learns how to fly in space using this fire extinguisher, just as we're learning how to fly these CubeSats out to Mars. So the team kind of picked up the names, and Marco B is officially Wally, and Marco A is Eva.
In the movie, Wally flies wildly through space as he learns to propel himself with the fire extinguisher. In a bit of serendipity with the movie, Marco's Wally started to flounder in its flight when its propulsion system developed a leak. Cody Colley explains.
One of the scariest things about the first observation of the leak was we noticed it and then we had the end of our scheduled contact. We can't have the radio on forever. We're a small spacecraft, so the power involved with keeping the radio on is sort of a non-starter. So the spacecraft is set to turn off at a certain time. So we got messages down from Wally saying, yeah, I'm leaking. I'm leaking. I've got to go now. I'll talk to you in 8 hours. That kind of situation is definitely sort of, it takes you by surprise. It's like, oh man. One of the things that made the situation a little bit more tense is that what we do is we schedule contacts for the spacecraft, and then if we don't give it new times to wake up, it goes into what's called its safe mode. This was, 5 days into the mission. It's kind of a hit in the gut to have to think about, okay, the spacecraft's gonna do basically the bare minimum to make sure that it's surviving, and we have to make the most of that. It changes data rates, it starts using different antennas, because it's saying, hey, I haven't heard from you, I need to hear from you. I'm gonna do everything I can to hear from you. And so we have to try out different things to find out how is the spacecraft pointed, what antennas is it using. But that was one reality that we were facing on that day, was if we didn't get commands into the spacecraft to take back the reins and tell it, hey, you're wake up on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, then we would have gone into this safe mode pattern where, every 8 hours the spacecraft turns on, but with a different antenna. And because we had the leak, we wanted to be able to get in and do things about it. And so we really didn't want to go into safe mode. So that next contact was definitely nerve-wracking. You send commands before you see that the radio signal's there. So you're sending these quote-unquote in the blind. So you're really worried about whether or not these commands are actually going to do anything. But lo and behold, for us, we were incredibly lucky. It was a very happy moment. We saw the spacecraft come back and talk to us. From day one, seeing a leak, day two, the leak has changed. We were able to actually start making assumptions about the behavior and then make decisions about what made sense to do next. There was a subset of people at a whiteboard trying to figure out, what is the best way forward? What are all the things that we could try, coming up with that solution? And so it's definitely like 48 hours of almost feeling like you were locked in a room, which it takes a toll. We really quickly realized we're gonna have to live with this leak all the way to Mars. It became a question then of what do we do to use the least amount of propellant to give us the best case, likelihood that we're gonna get to Mars. Sort of counterintuitive. What we ended up doing is telling the propulsion system to turn on every hour and dump the contents of that staging area that I told you about. If you let the leak that we knew about, the leak between the tank and that staging area develop, then what ends up happening is there's high pressure in that staging area that then is just venting out into space. And high pressure is bad. High pressure means that you have lots of torques on the spacecraft. It means that you're sending lots of propellant overboard. Propellant's valuable. On paper, it doesn't necessarily make sense, but in practice, it does. It's actually tell the propulsion system, get rid of everything in your staging area every hour. And what that does is maintains that staging area at a very low pressure all the time, so that the effect on the trajectory is really small, the effect on the amount of propellant that we're sending overboard is really small, and the spacecraft's able to point without really noticing that these, what are called blowdowns, are occurring.
There may not be life here, but we should still be cautious.
What we do ultimately is, in order to keep Wally in the right spot relative to each other, is Wally will do a blowdown in one direction and do that for a couple of days, and then he'll flip that by 180 and do it in the opposite direction. He's doing acrobatics on the way to Mars. He's changing which direction he's firing his thrusters in. It sounds kind of wild and punchy, but that has the net effect of we go away from where we're supposed to be, and then we come back. Sometimes we overshoot, but ultimately we come back to where we were supposed to be. If you watch that movie, the similarities between Marco and Wally are just way too many.
这个我感觉是一开头最开始那个预告片的建筑，就是最开始那个 teaser 的。啊，不是第二个预告片。
Although Marco B is leaking propellant, Andy Klesch says the CubeSats have received an unexpected boost from the sun.
One of our best surprises along the way was when we opened up the high-gain antenna. We're so light that we're essentially sailing on the solar wind. We have a finite amount of propellant that we can use, and eventually we're going to run out. So we want to minimize how much we're using. We're finding by tacking with respect to the solar wind, we don't have to use it as often, which essentially gives us more propellant for use later in the mission.
The propulsion system was just one of many challenges in getting the Marco project off the ground.
One of the things that we've noticed about the Marco technology is that it's not necessarily as easy as everybody thinks it is. It is a smaller package, but that also means it's much more dense.
为什么没有特征？我这么倒霉了。我也太倒霉了，是。
And because we're so dense and so small, getting the connections in place are very difficult. We have a much smaller team and a much lower budget.
因为这附近看这样子肯定有特征，我们可以再走走看。因为我看到了迹象。
So we might be smaller, but we're certainly not less complex.
The Marco team also had much less time than usual to pull together their mission.
I was pulled into the director of Solar System Exploration's office at the time, and he said, "We've decided to do this mission. We'd like you to be chief engineer. You have 3 days to put together a team. You're presenting to the executive council on Monday. Go." I immediately walked out there and started calling people and really trying to pull together the best team that we could in order to make this mission happen. One of the challenges of Marco was actually, could we do this as a lab to pull together a small spacecraft in that amount of time on there? And with that, there were many choices that we had to make. Could we put on advanced cameras on board, or would we just put on the best that we could at that time? We now have commercial cameras on board that we are able to take some images, but that was not always a sure thing along the way. It was the first thing that would be removed. We are hopeful that we might be able to take some images of Mars. We have been able to take a few images of Earth on the way out, but just the fact that we were able to image Earth from a CubeSat millions of kilometers away has been a fantastic early mission achievement.
If the Marcos are successful, Cody says that could open up the field for more ambitious CubeSat projects.
It means that your access to space, the bar is way lower. you're talking about decreasing the cost for a Mars mission by an order of magnitude. Granted, the capability isn't as large, but you can be far more tactical. That's what CubeSats are really good at.
是，和
我
我想的不一样。
do a very specific thing. If we're an order of magnitude cheaper, why don't we send an order of magnitude more? And that's where there are actually some applications where you're talking about measuring the magnetic field of other planets, where you really want lots and lots of measurements taken. You don't want to wait for your flagship mission to spend, 5 years to measure it. It's much more efficient to send 100 small spacecraft and a swarm that can make these measurements. You can also have one semi-big spacecraft that's sort of the mothership that receives all the data from all of its children and distributes that information. So there's different architectures that now that we're actually talking about sending hundreds of CubeSats, it's really meaningful for us to actually start thinking about them. In the past, they were, I would call it academic. I think we're finally getting to the point where it's not academic to talk about solutions like that.
So something that started out as a simple and cheap project for students could end up revolutionizing how we explore space.
Marco is sort of this Pathfinder mission to demonstrate years in advance that these technologies work. As the science capability for CubeSats has grown, we've inevitably looked, skyward, almost like manifest destiny. We want to go other places.
As for whether Teddy Ruxpin computer chips flew to Mars, I tried to track down whether the rumor is true. I contacted the Mars orbital camera manufacturer, conducted research with a JPL historian, and spoke to people who had been working on the missions that the camera flew on, Mars Observer and Mars Global Surveyor. Everyone had heard the rumor, but no one could confirm it. The chips hadn't been purchased directly from the manufacturer, Worlds of Wonder, but from layers of vendors who purchase and resell parts. I was told that the paper trail is so complex, it could take years to wade through it. But I had one more avenue of investigation, the ID number on the AT&T chips that were used in the Mars orbital camera. So I bought a circa 1985 Teddy Ruxpin doll that was being sold for parts, and with a little help from folks here at JPL, performed open heart surgery. The heart of the doll in this case was his circuit board, and it was, appropriately, located in his chest. The circuit board had 7 computer chips, but none of those chips were made by AT&T, and none of those chips were for memory. Instead, they were used for other tasks like managing power and voltage or audio amplification. The rumor, as far as I can tell, is wrong. However, it's still true that computer chips originally made for one product were repurposed for a camera sent to Mars. That product just isn't a Teddy Ruxpin doll. As often happens with gossip, the details may have gotten jumbled.
原来不是泰迪熊长扮。
Science, the hypothesis doesn't give you the answer you expected, but instead opens up new questions. Perhaps someone out there has the answer to this mystery. Next time on a mission.
That was kind of an investigative work, but we did actually go back to those tapes to see if anyone had come in between certain hours. So you really do feel like you're in a police department sometimes.
这帽子从里面好用，从外面就无语。
Subscribe, rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and share us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We're On a Mission, a podcast of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
I picked something up for you. Escape trajectory plotted.
Some days when
orbital insertion completed.
I think of how far I have come. All my lives led to this, and now I see what I've become. I always had doubted that I could ever be someone that mattered, that shattered all these glass ceilings up. All that I want is to see all the things that I could be. Destiny's calling me. We're children of the sky, flying up so high. Let me be that one to find the brightest sun. Children of the sky, guided by the light. Let me reach new heights, stars amongst the night. Children of the sky. just to believe. I've wanted to save us from ourselves. Just wanted to raise up to save us from ourselves. All that I want is to see all the things that we could be. Destinies calling me. We're children of the sky, flying up so high. Let me be that one to find the brighter sun. Children of the sky, guided by the light. Let me reach new heights, stars amongst the night. When we look back, what will we see? We were a part of everything. Up in the heavens, down to the seas. We were a part of everything. When we look back, what will we see? We were a part of everything. Up in the heavens, down to the seas. We a part of everything. Children of the sky, flying up so high. Children of the sky, take me to new heights. We're children of the
波江座 VI。波江座 VIA 继续前进，已勘察，但是却没有记录，这怎么能行？成何体统啊这 ？What the fuck？ 离谱！哎！
Please help us out. We're all. I had a good feeling about you. We just need a little. 2 units of ship parts will.
创。
You're a lifesaver. Here, take these for your help.
变电控制站。他走。波江座 VI-A， 这个是冰雪。.19， 极寒，无安全。资源只有水和铅。登录。
Another plan.
Need my help?
没有极端太阳辐射，什么都没啊！哎呀，来了，极端环境低温，极端太阳辐射 ，OK， 零下180度。下180度，这么狠！ 没拍照，靠的呢。shit， 哇，前面这座山怎么感觉很怪？石洞穴。这原来就一颗行星，等一下，我直接。
I picked something up for you.
1.2 LS。我将做 VIA， 波江座 VII， 也就是波江座7。波江座的星球也太多了。
In 1985, the talking teddy bear Teddy Ruxpin took the world by storm.
My name is Teddy Ruxpin. Can you and I be
来人了。
Teddy Ruxpin had a cassette tape player in his back. The cassettes made for the toy were special because while the left track of the tape held the audio recording, the right track contained data commands to move Teddy's mouth and eyes.
All he does is tell stories about friendship, caring, sharing. And he goes on adventures where the only thing he captures is a child's imagination.
We're going to have lots of good times.
This animatronic toy was seen as a marvel and made a fortune for the manufacturer, Worlds of Wonder. Teddy Ruxpin's inventor, Ken Forsey, had been working on the toy's concept long before it became a success. In the late 1950s, it was going to be a puppet. And instead of a teddy bear, it was going to be a monkey named Simeon Greet, in honor of NASA's space program. At the time, NASA was sending monkeys into space to see how they tolerated spaceflight before launching the first human astronauts.
Let's go to far-off places and search for treasures bright.
The success of Teddy Ruxpin was short-lived.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The longest distance race in human history was the competition to go to the moon. Neil Armstrong placing his foot on the lunar surface was equivalent to a runner crossing the finish line. The starter pistol had been the Soviet Union's launch of the first Earth-orbiting satellite, Sputnik.
CBS Television presents a special report on Sputnik 1, the Soviet space satellite. Douglas Edwards reporting.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this Earth. Suddenly, it has become as much a part of 20th century life as the whir of your vacuum cleaner. It's a report from man's farthest frontier, the radio signal transmitted by the Soviet Sputnik, the first man-made satellite as it passed over New York earlier today.
The space race was part of the Cold War between the U.S. and the USSR. In battle, you seek the high ground because it gives you an advantage over your enemy in what could be higher ground than the moon, which gazes down at our world from over 200,000 miles above. But it's not just fear or aggression that sparks competition between spacefaring countries. Launching a rocket off Earth is difficult, dangerous, and expensive, and consequently, space missions don't happen that often. So scientists and engineers battle fiercely to get their instrument on a spacecraft. For over 30 years, Bruce Bannert has been trying to put an earthquake measuring device called a seismometer on Mars. Back in the 90s, he was competing against a team of French scientists.
Philippe Lognanet was the PI of a program in France to develop a planetary seismometer to use on Mars. I was the PI of a program here at JPL to do the same thing. The difference is that I was working with some people here at the Micro Devices Lab on technology development for it, and he was actually building an instrument to fly on a Soviet, which became a Russian mission to Mars with the French Space Agency. And so, in some sense, he was farther along, but we, in our usual JPL arrogance, figured we had a better way to do it, but we just needed to develop the technology. And so when NASA started showing interest in the early 90s in actually flying a seismometer to Mars, we both come to meetings where, that kind of planning was being discussed, and we give our presentations, and we both would ask pointed questions of the other in terms of the capabilities of the proposed instruments and stuff like that.
NASA was trying to decide what instruments to include on its Pathfinder lander. Bruce and Philippe are running neck and neck to have their Marsquake measuring tool included on this mission.
So, we both kind of went at that hammer and tongs trying to get our instrument on Mars Pathfinder. And I think what we succeeded in doing is convincing the people in the project that neither one of the seismometers was really ready, because each of us had sort of damning criticism of the other guy and sort of a circular firing squad kind of a situation, and no seismometer actually flew on Pathfinder. After that, we both kind of realized that perhaps the best way to Mars wasn't by climbing over the other guy, but maybe, pulling each other up.
Instead of competing, they decided to cooperate. Today, Philippe is the principal investigator of the seismometer on InSight, which is currently on its way to Mars. And Bruce is the lead scientist of the overall mission.
Philippe and I are very different personalities, very different kind of scientific approaches, and I think we work really well together because of that.
That partnership is not the only foreign collaboration on the InSight mission. There are contributions from Germany, Spain, Poland, Belgium, and Canada, and scientists from many other countries are also involved in different aspects of the mission. As an international effort, you share the risks and the costs. Bruce says there are other benefits too.
Science doesn't really have borders, and smart people aren't all segregated into one country, and so if you really want all the smartest people and the best ideas, you throw a wide net, and you get people from all over the world who are, passionate about science, passionate about planetary science particularly, and they've been enriching, NASA missions for decades.
Start. 2, 1, booster ignition. We are receiving heartbeat from 0.7 meters a second. We've acquired the ground with the radar. We are wheels down on Mars.
Oh my God. This is amazing.
We're on a Mission, a podcast of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. I'm Leslie Mullen. This season, we've been talking to the people who work on InSight, a mission to land a spacecraft on Mars and explore the interior of the Red Planet. An InSight team member who knows a lot about the international nature of space missions is Farah Alibay. She's a payload systems engineer. That essentially means she has to make sure all the instruments on the spacecraft get along.
We have different partners that built these instruments, and they're all built individually and tested individually. But one of the things that we worry about is once we integrate them all together, are they going to work? And how do we track these things? My job is to test everything to make sure that it's going to work once we get to Mars.
Since InSight's instruments were built by groups in other countries, and the lander itself was built at the aerospace company Lockheed Martin, Farah has had to work with a wide range of people from different backgrounds and cultures. something she has, in a way, been doing her entire life.
Obviously, this is a podcast, so you can't see me, but I'm a woman of color, I have green hair, I'm definitely a minority, and I always
New
have
Atlantis
been.
Space Agents.
I remember when I was younger that was definitely a challenge for me.
Agents.
Because, you know, when you're a child, you just want to fit in. But with time, I actually learned to embrace that, and I learned to use that to my advantage, because how many brown women with green hair do you meet at JPL? There is only one, and it's me. So people remember me.
极端环境低温，极端太阳辐射。
I was born in Montreal, Canada, so I'm actually French speaking. That's my first language. But my parents were actually born in Madagascar, and I'm originally Indian. So definitely multinational. And I have dual nationality with French because Madagascar used to be a French colony. My parents left Madagascar during the Civil War, so they had to leave their homes behind, their businesses. The Civil War that I'm referring to was in the mid-70s. Madagascar has had unrest for a long time. It's never been the most stable country. But in the 70s, it got very difficult. So a lot of people actually left. My great-grandparents immigrated to France, and then my grandparents, my mom's family, immigrated to Montreal. So they lost everything. Cultural groups tend to stick together when they're immigrating. So my parents actually met through friends of friends in Canada. We moved out to a very small town just outside of Montreal where really working at NASA was just the stuff of movies, right? No one really left the town. We were the only non-white family in the little village that we lived in.
When Farah was 13, her family was uprooted yet again.
My dad, he's an electrical engineer, so he works in the paper industry and got offered a job in England. So that's when I moved to England as a teenager. And I only spoke French. I think the extent of the English I knew is if you ever took French or Spanish in high school, you know how to say, hi, how are you? I want to go to the zoo, and can I have spaghetti? Was pretty much the extent of it. And so they dropped me at school and were like, good luck. You have to speak English now.
At first, she struggled to learn her new language.
I had an entrance exam I had to take for my school because it was a selective school. It's not fee-paying, but they call them grammar school in England. And we had to do an English exam, which I failed horribly. I tried hard, but there was a math exam where I knew I could answer the math questions because math is a universal language, obviously. But I remember them asking, use the odd numbers in this series. I had completely forgotten what the difference between odd and even was because I remember the class they had taught us in English, like what the difference was. So I had to ask the math teacher, oh, I know one of them is 2, 4, 6, 8. Like, I totally know there's a difference, but which one is odd and which one is even?
Farah went from learning the basics of English to taking classes in advanced math. But she still wasn't sure what she wanted to do with her life. But then a movie provided inspiration.
I sort of knew I had an interest in space back from watching Apollo 13, pretty much.
This is Houston. Say again, please. Houston, we have a problem.
I remember really liking that movie, and it really did make a big difference in my life.
Okay, people, listen up. Just a moment of time. I want you all to forget the flight plan. From this moment on, we are improvising a new mission. How do we get our people home?
And I thought, wow, it's so cool that, these people get to work together and solve problems. I kind of liked the idea of solving problems in a team under pressure. But I never quite put 2 and 2 together that the path to doing that was real and that I could be an engineer. In high school, you take those online tests of what should my career be? And aerospace engineer came up as my top match. And I was like, oh, wait a second, this is a real job. I can do this. No one else really in my school wanted to become an engineer. It was an all-girls school. That wasn't really something that was done. Even my careers advisor said, well, engineering's a really male-dominated field. Do you really think you can do this? To which I answered, of course I can, because I'm very stubborn.
Farah studied aerospace engineering at the University of Cambridge in England. Then she headed for a whole new land and culture, Boston, Massachusetts, and MIT.
The work I was doing at Cambridge was more on the aero side. I was working on jet engines, which was really great, really fun, but, I really wanted to work in space. So when I got the offer from MIT, I took a deep breath and thought, well, if I'm going to go to grad school and pursue this dream, I might as well do it now, because if I say no now, that door might never be open again. My advisor, Jeff Hoffman, he was a shuttle astronaut, actually. He was part of the first group of non-military people that were selected to be shuttle astronauts, and he repaired Hubble the first time.
You're looking at a live picture from Space Shuttle Endeavour. Astronauts Jeffrey Hoffman and Story Musgrave are beginning to venture out into space to begin what is expected to be the 5th and final spacewalk of the Endeavour mission. Tonight, the astronauts will continue repairs to the Hubble telescope.
I was intimidated the first time I met him, but eventually we worked on a few projects together. When I was at Cambridge, it was a very traditional type of teaching. It's very thorough, but it's not quite as hands-on. And then I got to MIT, which has a hacking culture. You know, they put a police car on top of a building, and somehow that's a reasonable thing to do. We would never do that when I was at Cambridge. And you know, Cambridge is full of halls, we wear gowns, it looks like Harry Potter, and you get to MIT and it's just some odd 1960s buildings slapped together. So definitely a culture shock. But you know, part of why I value my education so much is because that difference is actually something that's made me more whole of a person, right?
Farah's studies at MIT led to JPL internships and, eventually, a job here.
I'm not getting pretty much a highlight of my life. I think it just all became real that we're sending this thing to Mars, like it's going to another planet. If you told 12-year-old Farah, who was learning English for the first time, that all of that would lead to this, I don't think she would have believed you.
Ce n'est plus vraiment l'enfance, le préau de tes 15 ans.
As I noted earlier, Farah is a payload systems engineer for the InSight mission, which means she had to make sure all the instruments, groups in different places, could communicate and cooperate when they finally came together. Her French skills came in handy for this task.
And it's great because it really helped build a bond with the French team, because I can talk to them. It's happened once in the meeting where they stopped the meeting and asked me in French, can you translate to make sure that we understood? So I started speaking in French and kind of forgot I was speaking French. And then someone else on the phone who was American was like, why are you all speaking French? I never thought growing up that me speaking French would ever be useful in an aerospace career, right? The French really like to make fun of me because I have a French-Canadian accent, and it's very different. It's a little bit like the difference between the British and an American accent, but there's more words that are different. In French, they will use English words, so they'll say weekend and parking. And in Canada, they're very strict about using French words, so every word that exists in English, they'll have a translation for it. It has to do with the history of Quebec and the fact that we had to really protect our language when the rest of the country was English before it became a bilingual country. So for example, the weekend, in France, they'll say le weekend, and in Canada, they'll say la fin de semaine, which basically is the end of the week. And the same with parking is stationnement. And then shopping is magasiner. But the French will use all these English words, and they'll just laugh at me whenever I come up with this French-Canadian word, because you can literally take a literal translation most of the time, and it works. They would come up with words and be like, oh, is snowboard planche à neige? Which is literally snowboard. And I was like, yeah, that's what it is. And it would just crack them up that they would just make up these words, and that happened to be the French-Canadian word.
Clear communication was vital as the instruments were being tested. Testing doesn't just focus on whether an instrument operates and collects the data scientists want. Testing also makes sure each instrument is hardy enough to operate in the harsh environment on Mars and can survive being blasted off Earth on a rocket.
We have something called validation and verification, which sounds very boring and does involve a lot of paperwork. But what it does involve is a lot of tests, and really cool tests. So we do things like we shake the spacecraft. So once all the instruments are installed, we put it on a shake table and shake it as hard as it would see it when you're launching, because that's the worst environment. We put it in a vacuum chamber and pull a vacuum and make it really, really cold, so that we can simulate what the spacecraft will feel on its way to Mars. Pulling a vacuum on the spacecraft and testing is actually a 24/7 test that runs all day and all night, and there's always delays and things that go wrong. I was working the evening shift and then the night shift. So obviously, what did happen, and it happens every single time, is that the schedule got shifted just enough that all the interesting stuff happened at night. Which is great if you don't want to fall asleep, but is terrifying if it's your first time doing this and your boss is sleeping. We definitely had one night where there was an issue with one of the instruments and it didn't behave the way we expected to. But if you can imagine when you've been working a night shift and it's 6 a.m. and your boss comes in and something's gone wrong and you suddenly have to sit down and explain as much as you know to them so you can hand off and go to bed, it's definitely stressful and it definitely stretches your ability to stay calm. The best approach when something goes wrong is to take your time, make sure that you've analyzed everything, that you've talked through all the possible solutions, and that you agree to a path forward. It's very different from our reaction as normal humans, right? If something goes wrong at home, my instinct is to press all the buttons until something happens. You cannot do that with a multi-million-dollar spacecraft.
It's stuck, yes?
Back off, you don't know the components.
They're components, American components, Russian components, all made in Taiwan. I'm telling you, please move. This is our big problem in the Russian space station. Because I don't want to stay here.
If anyone had the urge to pound on the spacecraft with a wrench, like the Russian cosmonaut did in the 1998 movie Armageddon, their actions would not have gone unnoticed.
We have cameras where the lander is. We actually control it from the control room. And there's cameras around where the operators are. And the idea for that is that if something goes wrong, or if we want to know what happened in the future, we can actually go back and look at the tapes and see what happened. For example, we were seeing noise in one of the tests at night. I was actually wondering if someone maybe had walked by the spacecraft. The seismometer, which is the main instrument, is a very, very sensitive seismometer. We tested it out in Denver because our spacecraft partner is Lockheed Martin and based in Denver. And you could hear the waves crashing in California and on the East Coast. So we had to discount that noise when we were looking at noise data. That's how sensitive it is. So that was investigating work, but we did actually go back to those tapes to see if anyone had come in between certain hours. And it ended up being someone opening a door in a different building. So you really do feel like you're in a police department sometimes.
As Farah and her colleagues tested the instruments and spacecraft, they came up with different ways to stay calm and focused.
It started off as a squat competition. You know those wall squats? Some people are really good at them. And then it became a push-up competition, which I am no good at. I can do maybe 5 push-ups on a good day. So someone suggested yoga, and it became a tradition. We didn't really want anyone to see us do yoga because we're not that great. So we picked an area where we tested out all the cameras to make sure that no one could see us in that little area. As a lot of young engineers, we don't necessarily know each other. So it was also a great way to bond, and becoming friends really helped us in terms of teamwork later too.
When InSight arrives at Mars on November 26th, Farah will be with other team members at JPL. They'll be supporting each other, a team of people from all around the world, united with a single purpose: to wait for the signal that tells them whether InSight survives its landing.
I remember when the Curiosity rover landed, I was an intern and I couldn't watch. I was nearly crying because I was so terrified that something would go wrong, because it's such a big deal. Now that it's actually mine, yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see what happens. But either way, it'll be really cool. All the team will be here, because the foreign partners are actually going to be here the first few months for operations. So we'll all be together.
And she might even change her signature green hair color for the rare occasion of landing on the red planet.
I'll probably dye it red for landing, just for good luck and to fit within the theme.
Next time on A Mission.
When something matters to you as much as a mission that you've worked on for, in this case, the last 5 or 6 years, you just pretty much pray. Once it arrives at the planet and it kicks off the cruise stage, you don't control anything.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe, rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and share us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We're On a Mission, a podcast of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
Over.2018年11月。
Long before GPS, Google Maps, and cell phones, travelers navigated by the stars. The brightest stars in the sky form recognizable constellations that can act as guideposts. Ancient Polynesians, for instance, were adept at celestial navigation and used it to sail from island to island throughout the vast South Pacific.
We sail the length of the seas on the ocean breeze. At night we name every star, we know where we are.
In the Disney film Moana, in order to track down the demigod Maui, Moana heads for a constellation that looks like a fishhook. In the West, we call this constellation Scorpius.
When it's time to find home, we know the way.
天蝎座
Spacecraft also orient themselves by the stars. Every spacecraft has a star tracker, which helps keep it on the right path. In space, there is no obvious up or down, right or left, so the star tracker indicates how the body of the spacecraft is positioned as it flies on its journey. The InSight mission has been flying to Mars for 6 months now. On November 26th, InSight will reach Mars. As it enters the atmosphere, the spacecraft's view of the stars will dim and then disappear. The star tracker will then be jettisoned, having achieved its mission of bringing InSight through 300 million miles of space to its final destination. At that point, the real danger begins.
Start. 2, 1, boost ignition. We are receiving heartbeat codes at this time. 0.7 meters a second. We've acquired the ground with the radar. We are wheels down on Mars.
Oh my God. This is amazing.
We're on a Mission, a podcast of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. I'm Leslie Mullen, and this is the final episode of the season. It's about the challenge and peril of landing on Mars. It's often said that the most dangerous parts of an airplane flight are the takeoffs and landings. The same can be said for a mission to Mars. Blasting a rocket off Earth is one of the most dangerous parts of every space mission. InSight faced that risk and launched without a hitch back in May. Now InSight must enter the Martian atmosphere, descend down through it, and land safely on the planet's surface. As I noted in earlier episodes, this is referred to as EDL, Entry, Descent, and Landing. InSight has to do this dangerous task entirely on its own. Rob Grover is in charge of EDL for InSight.
It takes 8 minutes, at least for the InSight landing, for a radio signal to get out to Mars, so we can't really, in real time, control the vehicle when it's landing and use a joystick, so it all has to be independent and by computer automation. And that makes it particularly challenging.
About an hour before landing, engineers will have sent their final commands to the spacecraft. All they can do then is sit back and hope everything works perfectly. The InSight capsule needs to enter at an angle of 12 degrees. Any shallower than that, it'll skip off the top of the atmosphere and bounce back into space. Any steeper than that, it will melt and burn up. That's because the capsule is going almost 13,000 miles per hour, or 5.6 kilometers per second.
As it plunges deeper into the atmosphere, we're using the atmosphere to slow down. We're basically taking out a lot of the energy that was put into it by the rocket when it left Earth, so we have to take all that energy out so we can get to the surface essentially with no energy. We want to be stopped, obviously. So the atmosphere really helps us with that, but it also creates a lot of friction when it's slowing down through the atmosphere, and it generates a lot of heat. So we have a heat shield to protect the lander inside. We use a parachute about halfway through the landing to slow us down even more.
Opening the parachute is one of the most uncontrolled aspects of landing.
When we deploy the parachute, it's a flexible material, and that can act a little more randomly and unpredictably in a rigid metal structure as the lander is. And so there's a little bit of maybe chance in that. So we're always relieved when the parachute's out successfully. When we deploy the parachute, believe it or not, about 99% of the energy that we had at the top of the atmosphere has been taken out. We're probably going about 70 meters per second, about 150 miles an hour. So when the parachute opens, it's a big tug to the capsule, and the capsule kind of rings like a bell. It kind of swings back and forth underneath the parachute. We wait for that to die down, so 15 seconds later, and then we drop the heat shield off. 10 seconds after that, we deploy the legs. There's 3 legs, and they all pop open within a half second of each other, one at a time. The next big thing is to get the radar activated so we can start seeing the ground.
Rob says one of the most nerve-wracking moments will be waiting for the radar to turn on and see the Martian ground.
We actually need it to land. If we don't have the radar working, the vehicle's understanding of its position and velocity is not good enough to land successfully. That'll be another big moment in the control room when we get verification that the radar has seen the ground. Our radar on InSight is actually a modified radar that's used on F-16 fighter jets. We love our radar, but it also has some quirkiness to it. For example, if we start using it above about 10 kilometers, there is a chance that it could be spoofed. I think it's seeing the ground, but it's not really seeing the ground. And there are other kind of corners of where we operate the radar where it's, similar things can happen, and we spend a lot of time understanding where those idiosyncrasies are, and we just avoid using it under those situations.
If the radar works, then when InSight drops down to 3,300 feet, or the elevation of a small mountain, the parachute will be cut loose, and InSight will briefly go into free fall. Then the retro rockets kick in.
Our lander has actually 12 descent engines. 6 of them are pointed directly down, 6 of them are canted slightly, so that we can actually do roll of the vehicle. Because we're just using the descent engines to keep the vehicle pointed in the right direction and slow it down. They don't throttle up and down as you kind of think about a car throttling. We control thrust by pulsing them on and off. And they're actually pulsing 10 times a second. So if you were standing on the surface of Mars and you were watching the vehicle come down, it would kind of sound like a jackhammer. We slow it out enough that we reach the velocity that we want to land at, which is about 2.4 meters per second, or about 5 miles an hour. There are switches in the top of the legs of the lander, and when one of them touches the ground, that switch clicks and that automatically shuts off the engines. We know we've reached the ground.
All of EDL, from the top of the atmosphere to touchdown on the surface, happens in a mere 6.5 minutes. For those in mission control, that's a long time to hold your breath.
The flight computer and the flight software is doing all of this by itself on Mars. The spacecraft and software and machinery and everything is very complex. And so we do everything we can do to make sure that everything is going to work properly. Certainly we're humans, and so something might have been overlooked. There's always that possibility, but we do everything we possibly can do to eliminate that. So there's the complexity part of it, and then there's the unknown about going to Mars and landing in a new place and landing during dust storm season. Even though we've been successful a number of times in the past, it's always risky to land on Mars.
InSight will be landing near the Martian equator in a region called Elysium Planitia. Here's Bruce Banner, lead scientist on the mission.
When InSight lands on Mars, it's going to be in a pretty flat area. It's going to look like a desert. It's going to maybe look like a lake bottom in a desert because it's going to be really flat and really featureless, we think. But it's not really a lake bottom. It's actually an old lava flow. But probably you won't be able to see anything for miles and miles. I think InSight's going to appreciate the fact that we're going to be, talking to it every day and keeping it company, because it's going to be lonely on Mars. It's going to be cold. It's going to be very flat, not particularly interesting scenery. So I think it's going to have to be content with listening to Mars and listening to the Mars quakes happening, and then talking to us back on Earth in order to sort of keep from going crazy from being so lonely.
Matt Gollenbeck is a geologist on the InSight mission. He describes how it would feel to be on the surface of Mars.
Imagine a super dry place where the grains would probably crunch underneath your feet as you walked. Really dry desert with no foliage of any type whatsoever. Sandy surfaces with rocks poking out. So think of places like the dry Southwest, where foliage is pretty down to a minimal amount. And that would be kind of the feel for it. Although the temperature would be remarkably low, the high temperature at the warmest part of the day is maybe 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And on a daily basis, that temperature changes by 100 degrees or more Fahrenheit from day to night. And the temperature at your feet would be warmer than that at your nose by 30 degrees. And if you could feel it, there'd be those little wind eddies that would rise off the ground. And of course, you have to be in a spacesuit because the The air is not breathable, and the pressure is so low that without one, you'd probably explode in an instant.
Although humans have not yet traveled to Mars, Matt has a good feel for the environment there. That's because he evaluates possible landing sites for all of NASA's Mars rovers and landers.
That's what I do. I'm the landing site dude.
To figure out the best places to land, Matt and his colleagues use images taken by satellites that orbit Mars.
You have images from space that are not high enough resolution to look at the fabric and texture of a rock. You're just seeing these landforms. In certain cases, you have an idea what kind of materials are there, but in lots of cases, it's not all that clear, and it's not exactly what you think it is.
Trying to find a landing site just based on satellite photos would be like trying to figure out what house you wanted to purchase by only looking at maps. So Matt and his team use other tricks to learn more about potential landing sites.
We mapped out the rocks and the rock distribution, so if the rock is bigger than 1.5 meters or so, it casts a shadow, and you can look at that shadow and measure the shadow and estimate the size of the rock. And we used a machine vision technique to, in fact, measure several 100,000 rocks.
They also looked at craters made by meteorites, which hit the surface of Mars like pellets from a cosmic shotgun.
It's coming in at extremely high speeds, kilometers per second, hypervelocity as we call it. And that creates a crater that has a fairly well-known geometry. The ejecta, the material that's thrown out, comes from the top 10% of the diameter of the crater, fairly shallow. We noticed that any crater that was bigger than 100 to 200 meters had rocks in the ejecta. And that meant that those craters found hard, coherent rock at about 20 meters depth. But when we looked at smaller craters that were 3 meters to 5 meters, they had no rocks in the ejecta whatsoever. And that implies there was no hard rock for them to eject out. So we used the diameter of the rocky ejecta crater to map the thickness of the regolith across the landing site.
It's important to know the consistency of the ground because InSight needs to drill down into it.
We have a heat flow probe that hammers its way down 3 to 5 meters below the surface. And that requires broken up regolith, sandy material. It can't penetrate into hard rock. So one of our site selection criteria was verifying that we had broken up regolith and mostly sandy material for the top 5 meters.
But they didn't want the ground to be too soft either.
There are places on Mars where there are probably meters thickness of extremely fine-grained dust, kind of like talcum powder. That's not load-bearing. If you were to come down at that surface, you would probably just sink right through it. Definitely not a good place with all that dust to put a lander that's operating solar power, because then it'll...
Back home again. Always happy to meet a stranger. Oh, and now you've made mine. Afraid my ship's got the next jump plotted in, so I'm away. Fair travels.
Cool off. So at night, a snake will wrap itself around a big rock or a road to stay warmer because they don't control their surface temperature like mammals do. The road has a high inertia. High inertia surfaces will change temperature much more slowly, and low inertia surfaces will change temperature much more quickly. You can model the particle size that you would need to produce that inertia type surface, and that was one of the techniques we used. There are places on Mars that have extremely low inertia. Those are these very dusty places. So we didn't want any of those, but we didn't want areas that had really high inertia because that would indicate too many rocks and or cemented material, and we wanted just the right kind of low inertia and indications of the sandy substrate. And that's actually one of the cool parts about being the landing site dude, is that you make a prediction of what the surface is, and then after you land, you get to see whether or not you were right or not. And lots of times in planetary science, you don't get to check your hypothesis directly, but I do.
Once InSight lands on Mars, it has to use its robot arm to put instruments on the ground. In a way, that's like landing on Mars a second time.
After we land, we have a crescent-shaped zone in front of the lander that the arm can reach. And the most important thing to do is to get the instruments out on the surface. Well, those instruments have requirements about how steep the terrain can be. They don't want rocks underneath their feet. Well, if you think about it, that's exactly what I do with landing sites, except it's on a smaller scale right in front. We have cameras on the spacecraft that can look around in color and stereo, and so we can measure the number and size of rocks, we can map the landforms. That's my main job, and it will happen fairly quickly after landing because the first thing you're doing is looking around.
Matt has spent years surveying that alien landscape and scrutinizing the rocks of Mars.
Yeah, I never had a rock collection or anything, still don't. The rocks themselves aren't the interesting thing to me. It's what they tell you about how the planet was. In any rock on Earth, you just use a rock hammer and a hand lens. If you can identify the rock, you can tell uniquely how it got to be there. That tells you the environment when it was deposited. So if you think about it, geologists can open the book of the planet. The point of the InSight mission is to understand how the planet's differentiated. So all of the planets that we've been to have a central metallic core, composed mostly of iron, and then an iron and magnesium-rich mantle, and then this crust that we walk around on the surface. And the question is, how did that differentiation occur, and what's happened since then? And Mars is just the right size to record that differentiation, but not to have destroyed all the evidence of its early history. Mars is the Goldilocks planet, it's just the right size.
There's that Goldilocks again. When it comes to planets, she prefers Mars.
The problem is the Earth and Venus are so large and so active, they've destroyed the early history. They've resurfaced, and they're really mostly young rocks on the surface. On the other hand, the Moon and Mercury are too small, and they have very old surfaces, but nothing young. And Mars is just big enough that it's had geologic activity throughout the entire history of the solar system. And that's the only place that we have like that.
Matt has a lot of experience sending spacecraft to explore Mars.
I call myself the oldest Martian because I started working full-time on Mars with no other object of work since 1992. So that's a sequence of, almost 25 years now. The good thing is that means there's been plenty of work on Mars, and that's been our renaissance of Mars exploration, really.
That renaissance has seen many successes, but also a few failures. Matt is well aware of what a risky venture a mission to Mars can be.
When something matters to you as much as a mission that you've worked on for, in this case, the last 5 or 6 years, you just pretty much pray. Once it arrives at the planet and it kicks off the cruise stage, you don't control anything. All of that is automated. It's 7 or 10 minutes of terror that they talk about, where 100 different pyrotechnic devices have to go off perfectly, and any one of those doesn't work, and the whole thing, doesn't work. Same thing with the rocket. The most reliable launch vehicles we have are reliable 95 to 98 times out of 100. So how many times would you get in your car knowing that 2 to 5 times out of 100 when you turn the key it was going to blow up? You would probably not drive your car anymore. And yeah, that's the only way to get to Mars. So that's what I mean. All you can do is pray.
EDL specialist Rob Grover has had a run of successful landings. From his first experience at Mars with the Spirit rover in January 2004, followed by the Opportunity rover later that same month, and the Phoenix lander in 2008.
So with each one of those previous 3 landings, I was also lucky enough to be in the control room, which we call the mission support area, or the MSA. My experience was just actually doing it after working on it for so many years. It was just kind of felt surreal that it was actually happening. Surreal, exciting, nerve-wracking, all those kinds of things. I remember with Spirit and Opportunity, particularly with Spirit, since Spirit was the first landing, we had been working on the landing for so many years, and we're always working in simulation, and we're looking at numbers, a lot of numbers, and it becomes a little bit abstract in that sense. But then when we actually landed and the first picture came back from Mars and we were on the surface of Mars, it was just like, wow, this is all real. This is very cool. So if we don't accept the risks, we don't get to explore, we don't get to discover things on Mars, and that's a really thrilling part of being able to do this.
Although this is the last episode of the season, the story doesn't end here. You can learn much more about the InSight mission by visiting our website, mars.jpl.nasa.gov/insight. You can also watch the landing coverage there starting at 11 a.m. Pacific Time or 2 p.m. Eastern on November 26th. If InSight sticks its landing and works as planned, in a few months I hope to have a bonus episode to highlight mission discoveries. Before I started doing research and interviews for this podcast, the InSight mission felt to me like one of the more dry and technical types of scientific investigations. But after months of talking to people on the mission, hearing not only their struggles to get this mission off the ground, but also getting to know them as people rather than just as scientists, I've come to care for them and for this mission in ways I never expected. I now share their passion for this mission, and I feel like I'm a part of it. By listening to this podcast, I hope you, the listener, also feel that way. We are all on this mission, together. But whatever happens with InSight, it is but one small chapter in the grand epic of space exploration. That story includes our moon, our sun, all the other places in our solar system, and thanks to new technology and methods, even
如果人在零下168度的环境待一会儿会怎么样？
Our journey to learn about and even visit other worlds will continue. At the start of this episode, I said the stars have long been used for navigation. Since ancient times, those points of light in the dark sky have been reliable guideposts for travelers. The horizon beckons, and the stars are still in our sights. But instead of just guiding the way, the stars themselves are now our destination. Just as in Moana's song in the Disney movie, as we set sail on the cosmic sea, there's no telling how far we'll go.
What's beyond that line? Will I cross that line? The line with the sky, it's the sea. It calls me, and no one knows how far it goes. If the wind in my sail on the sea stays behind me, one day I'll know how far I'll go.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe, rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and share us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We're On a Mission, a podcast of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
Four. 你就对。原来是自动保存，靠！Bonus episode。哎，这一集播不了哎，怎么回事？
Pretty much every day on Earth is a day of Russian roulette. There have been dramatic examples of hazards from space, such as the Chelyabinsk airburst that happened over Russia in 2013.
陨石，这个是
We're
不是
getting close to 800,000
这个看起来就
objects,
像陨
and
石
in。fact calculate absolutely everything in the solar system. So that's pretty cool.
We weren't out just exploring chunks of rock. Dawn explored two of the last uncharted worlds in the inner solar system.
Psyche is both the name of a metal asteroid in the outer asteroid belt, and it's the name of the mission that we are sending to go visit that asteroid. There is only one large metal object in our solar system, and so this will be the very first time that
这个
humankind
星球上
will
有
ever
流
go
星雨
into space to visit a metal world, a new kind of
说
exploration.
对了吧？哎，这直接预言，不是？咱们现在看多了，已经能总结出来规律。
reason to take pause and wonder about things from above.
There are millions of asteroids, and each one has a story. Season 2 of On a Mission begins October 8th.
The sky is falling.
И сгорел там, да?
On February 15th, 2003, the sky exploded in Russia.
It looked like a scene from a movie, but it was all too real. A meteor came crashing down to Earth today, triggered a fireball over Russia.
As 1,000 people have been injured in central Russia after a meteor smashed into the Ural Mountains.
But NASA tells us that it's got to be at least the size of, say, a kitchen table for it to enter our atmosphere and cause an explosion. So this was a decent-sized chunk of rock.
Followed by an almost apocalyptic scene, a blinding flash of light, and then all hell broke loose.
When the meteor over Chelyabinsk tore through the atmosphere and exploded, it produced a flash brighter than the sun and gave many witnesses an instant sunburn. The flash caused people for miles around to run to their windows to see what was going on. Unfortunately for them, the shockwave then hit, blasting those windows into millions of flying glass shards. The shockwave also knocked some right off their feet. More than 1,500 people were injured that day. This wasn't the first time a massive meteor blew up over Russia. Over 100 years ago, in 1908,
我们现在面前看到的就是
exploded near the Podkamenaya Tunguska River in Siberia.
这个播客在讲的是俄罗斯2013年的一起陨石事件，造成1500人受伤。
The energy released is estimated to have been 1,000 times greater than from an atomic bomb.
你说巧不巧？听到这一集的时候，正好就逛到一个流星雨撞击地点。要我说太巧。
clear out of his chair and briefly lost consciousness. He awoke to an apocalypse.
Suddenly the sky was split in two, and high above the forest, the whole northern part of the sky appeared to be covered with fire. I felt a great heat as though my shirt had caught fire. At that moment, there was a bang in the sky and mighty crash. The crash was followed by a noise like stones falling from the sky or of guns firing. The earth trembled.
哇，怎么还这么热？烧伤吧。
Start, 2, 1, booster ignition. We are receiving heartbeat codes time. 0.7 meters a second. We've acquired the ground with the radar. We are wheels down on Mars.
Oh my God. This is amazing.
Welcome to On a Mission, a podcast of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. I'm Leslie Mullen, a science journalist based at JPL. In the first season of this podcast, I shared the stories and science behind the InSight mission to Mars. In this second season, instead of focusing on a single mission, we're going to look at space rocks, also known as asteroids, from the view of many missions. This is Season 2, Episode 1. The Sky is Falling.
天空在坠落。 坠落之天，坠落天空。
Asteroids go by many names: near-Earth object, planetesimal, planetoid, minor planet, meteoroid, quasi-moon. When they hit Earth's atmosphere, they become meteors or bolides. When they smash into the ground, they're called meteorites. There are Trojans, Greeks, and centaurs, asteroids as actors in an ancient play. Comets are basically icy asteroids that release water vapor and dust as they're warmed by the sun. What an asteroid is called largely depends on where it is and what it's doing.
It's a meteor shower.
This new one you're tracking, how big?
It's what we call a global killer. Nothing would survive, not even bacteria.
Movies like Armageddon depict a massive asteroid hitting Earth, causing widespread destruction and chaos. Huge rocks falling from the sky could take out a city, a nation, or even lay waste to the whole planet, and that can feel like the universe is out to get us. Daily news headlines that scream about asteroids coming too close to Earth encourage this paranoia. The truth is, our planet is in the middle of a cosmic shooting gallery. Asteroids often fly by, and the Earth is hit every day with hundreds of tons of dust grains and small rocks. Most of them burn up in the atmosphere, and sometimes we see them as meteor showers or shooting stars.
When you wish upon a star, makes no
本来我去热海的时候，他们说能看到什么狮子座流星雨，结果我啥也没看到，可能因为多雨。
Do little to no damage. It's the big ones we worry about. And there are big asteroids out there, monsters lurking in the dark, large enough to take us out. Currently, none of the really big asteroids are headed for us, but we haven't found them all. JPL maintains a list of all the known potentially hazardous asteroids. You can find them on the Center for Near-Earth Object Studies website. The list is updated all the time thanks to telescopes dedicated to hunting down new asteroids. And that's where this season's journey begins.
Starting route to Stewart Observatory Mirror Lab.
I'm in Tucson, home of the Lunar and Planetary Laboratory at the University of Arizona, a major center for asteroid studies. I'm driving up to nearby Mount Lemmon, the site of the Catalina Sky Survey. This survey is one of several that scan the skies every night in search of asteroids that come close to Earth. As I drive near the base of the mountain, I see legions of saguaro cactus populating the red rocks. They're the kind of cactus I think of as cartoonish because I first saw them in Bugs Bunny Roadrunner cartoons. The cacti are like green fingers pointing the way. Up they all seem to gesture, encouraging this journey up the long and winding mountain road up to the stars. And up I go, all the way to the top. Even though it's about 95 degrees Fahrenheit in Tucson, there's ice on the road as I reach the summit. Greg Leonard, the astronomer working this night, greets me at the observatory gate. As we drive in, I see several large domes, standing starkly white against the rocky landscape. There's something vaguely alien about them in this natural setting, reminding me of the black monolith in Stanley Kubrick's movie 2001: A Space Odyssey.
库布里克。
Like the monolith in that movie, these sentinels are tied to the stars. The observatory domes are painted bright white to deflect heat. Heat is the enemy of stargazing because it messes with the sensors in the telescopes inside the domes. Heat also can disturb the atmosphere, blurring our view of the cosmos. Greg takes me inside the observation dome and opens a portion of the roof to the sky, just as the sun sinks below the horizon. The observatory is a big, echoey, mostly empty space, except for some mechanical equipment and a large telescope in the middle of it.
So we're opening up the Mount Lemmon Station 60-inch, 1.5-meter Cassegrain reflecting telescope. This is one of my favorite times of night when we open up and we can see the sun is set. There's few to no clouds up above us. And it's kind of the promise of the night to come. And maybe we're going to discover some near-Earth asteroids if the skies are clear.
The telescope is about 10 feet long and has a mirror in the bottom.
The light from stars or the night sky comes down, hits the big mirror. The mirror is just like a big pupil. It's a big eye. It just collects that much more data than your eye will collect. Then it bounces that light back up to the top. And that's where our sensor is. That collects the images and the data that get piped into the warm room where our computer rack is.
The top of the mountain is cold, which is good for telescopes, but not so good for people. In the past, astronomers would have to suffer all night long, hunched over telescopes in temperatures so cold, their photographic plates would crack.
这就为什么天文台都建在山上，是为了温度，其实是为了温度，因为温度会干扰那个 stargazing， 干扰观星。
chairs, a big computer rack, many computer monitors, and a red phone. But Greg claims the phone isn't a hotline to the White House to report an oncoming asteroid. Greg sits at the computer to focus the telescope, and then the observing run begins. One of the computer monitors shows the night sky overlaid with a grid of rectangles. Each rectangle in the grid is called a field, and the telescope takes a series of images from each one.
We're going to start tonight here at set number 1. It's going to take a 30-second picture of this field. And when it's done that, it moves to the next field over. Takes 30-second image there. And it'll launch through the entire set of 12 fields. When it's finished with the 12th one, it's going to go back to the first one. It's going to do the same thing. This happens 4 times. And the set takes, roughly 40 minutes or so. Then it's going to move on to set 2.
The asteroids and stars all look like bright dots. The word asteroid actually comes from the Greek word for starlight. The big difference here is the stars appear eternally fixed.
Oh, 地地子武器没开，靠！
fireflies. By taking several photos of the same patch of sky over time, the computer can compare the images and see if any dots of light are moving against the background stars. The speed the asteroids move can indicate how close they are. Faster ones generally are nearer to Earth than the points of light that barely crawl from one image to the next. The computer also figures a rough size based on how bright they are. Asteroids are typically dark rocks, but sunlight reflecting off their surfaces make them look, from our vantage point, like tiny stars. So the bigger the asteroid, the brighter the asteroid. But this brightness rule of thumb only works if they're all the same distance from us. Combining their brightness with their speed provides a better estimate of how big and far away they really are.
And after several minutes, upon completing set 1, it will start presenting me, the observer, with
准备。
Oh my God.
对接舱呢？啊，对接舱在楼上啊，原来。我自己都忘了对接舱在哪了。哎，靠！我对接舱呢？
Important or not, I'm ready to listen.
这就搞笑了，这下。找不到了，可还行？嗯。在自己的船里迷路，这啊，在这儿，靠！哎，靠，在这儿。哦，那个 bug 还没修，那这不容易了吗？那这船我开走了，直接就靠，船舱里总有东西吧？确实有。 我是不是做一下实际上就可以啊？哎，做一下不行哎。哦，要设为主飞，还是？哦，对，设为主飞船，然后再回去就行。别走啊！完了。 怎么 ？No！ 你不要走啊！完蛋了，他走了。我要去太空港才能弄回来吗？意思是？我都好久没抢船了。啊，不对，可以对接，你不要走！站住！ 飞船，再看一下船员，应该都分配在飞船上，没问题。6个人，他走了。等会儿要改这艘船，传感器接触。回去以后把这艘船改成下一个我要造的船，下一个要造什么都还没想好，但我有很多的计划。 点一下东西，撞上去。特征投掷场，投掷场。 这个星球图片怎么没上？这儿。啊，温度啊！再下去。 等等，怎么这么多东西没记呀？fuck！ 那我刚才怎么就上来了？大气，水与大气，还要下去一次。
Touching down.
Hey there. Glad to see you again.
OK， 现在记一下：极端环境、低温、 极端太阳辐射，168度零下。这样才算完整。下一个，出发。就漏了这几个数据，实际上。
I have something for you, Captain. Time to leave this place behind.
There. Stable orbit achieved, like a toy sailboat rig.
EIC， 接下来是我们的8号。将做8。
What have we got here? Don't look like a fellow homesteader. Something you wanted? You seen what a new Model A is going for these days? They're handy and all, but no robot's worth that much. You'd be surprised how popular it's becoming. There's even a group trying to organize all us independent settlers. Call themselves LIST. Been considering signing up. Little extra support never hurt. Got some knickknacks I could part with.
它有啥？它就这2个东西。不过，它倒是有一点点钱。数量我氦3这么多，我没有用啊。我留这么多氦3没有用，这氦3哪来的我都想知道。我留这么多水也没有用。有些东西留太多，卖给他。波江座8号。荠菜巨型。4.2。未知。巨大。0055公里。未知。波江座8有4颗卫星。首先，我们当然是访问1号 A Alpha。 延迟高速公路。
Hail received. Something wrong? Finally earned my UC citizenship not too long back. Took years to get it, but now I can finally buy myself a place in New Atlantis. Once I save up the credits.
话说新亚房子多少钱来着？忘了。
United colonies are a nice place to settle down, so long as you avoid the well on New Atlantis.
深井区也比霓虹城好多了呀。但是虽然啊深井区有问题，但是真的比霓虹城好多。哎，把这个卖。减轻负担，这就叫。好白啊！我靠，纯白一片。Holy shit！ 这是不是有点太白了？是不是游戏的亮度调太亮？是不是 brightness 调太亮？靠！但这是默认的 brightness 吗 ？HDR brightness。这反光反的，我的天！狠啊！有水和铜。下降。
Landing site looks clean. Let's set it down.
你不要每次都站在那个入口，迟早要给这个飞船改改。我到底什么时候改？这样，我勘探完这个星球，就去改船造船去。这个船必须要改一改了，而且我想造一艘新的船。刚才抢了船也是为了这个目的而选。Story time， 谁给你 story time？ 没空。为什么这东西歪了？ 零下219度，明白。零下219。0度，0%，否 ，done。把资源探一下就行，2个，太容易了。 这里有铜，还需要什么水？钛3还是水啊？还需要水。其实这表面的雪呀，这表面的冰雪应该就是水才对。它是要你扫液态水，不是让你扫那个固态水。其实也是，如果要论水的话，这都是水，好吗？诶。
If you find anything significant, say the word.
I picked something up for you.
Ship's clear and the sky's cold. Orbital insertion complete. You may now move freely about the cabin.
Insertion complete. Shit！ 哎我靠！这什么突袭啊？这是离谱！4个，炮台开火。准备接舷，他们全 offline 上。我们这个科考船配备的是这个。这船也归我，全通通没收，通通没收。
Ship is now docked. Perfect. Didn't even smudge the paint.
我的舰队，通通都是我。
Weird. I was just thinking.
哦，现在船上都没人，因为未知原因。他好像说下个更新要修这个问题，倒是方便我，但是问题是我还想打些人。船舱。 别走，别走。
Done. We are now free to move among the stars.
Airlock integrity looks good.
抢了2艘，战果不错，回去有的可造。这边其实有友军。 人家刚才在登陆星球，被他们给打断，真是这个。OK B， 这是一颗岩石星球。 商人货车。
Always another delivery. Now, were you looking to make a purchase? Knew this woman who worked graveyard shift for Hope Tech, the shipbuilder? Said they're serious taskmasters. Guess you don't get that successful by being inefficient. Oh, it's our job to sniff out the best money-making opportunities in the galaxy. Oh, well, why didn't you say so?
为什么贸易管理局反而更穷啊？喂，你们是不是搞错了什么东西啊？喂，天哪，他们怎么更穷？比普通的市民还穷，是没想到的。 穷疯了，真的。波江做 VIP。
Alright,
这边居然有稀薄氮气。水是重金属，那它还是一个……我操，这么多资源，水害死1000银。水与大气。岩石上有山口。冰封高原。
Setting down, everything in the green.
没有吧？
If you need something.
Perhaps not the sort of place on which one would settle down.
极端环境低温，玉器之中多极端，平均温度零下215度。 均温度零下215，氧气含量0。这是波江座8B。天气不错，不过这个是稀薄的氮气大气层。 而且它有水，但是水是重金属。有大气有水，但是没有生命，因为目前的情况。还缺这个波和乙。
Even when I see it with
All like that used in war.
这个地方真是难找。去沙漠上找也许更好找，因为这边本来就是蓝的，这扫描器也是蓝的，根本看不到。 灾害天气下雨 ，What the fuck？ 又怎么了？灾害天气下雨，天气预警。为什么下雨是灾害天气啊？这鬼地方形容太随便了。如果它这里的下雨是灾害天气的话，我们就要写一下。难道是冻雨？我们先写一下灾害天气。如果等会儿变了的话，再改就行。看着温度应该是冻雨之类的。地下水侵蚀洞穴。没截过图 ，Let's go， 就那里。确实要下雨了，我看。既然它是危害天气，我们不如直接进洞避一避。
For that thing.
Shit！ 冻结液体，直接他妈开始了，直接冻伤了，当场什么鬼东西啊？零下200多度的液体，不是，这怎么可能？这是液，上面是氮气，那下的岂不是下的什么？下的是液氮吗？难道这雨？这个雨下的是 H2O 还是什么东西？靠！这个 fuck 灾害天气，那我把这个改掉，你直接就是冻结液体。然而我只有1周目，我也只玩1周目，我永远也不会开2周目，起码目前来看，说不定哪天想看看。存了个档，那也许，但是我认真玩的只会有这1周目，然后我会一直以这1周目为基础，去玩 DLC 啊，去玩 mod 呀等等，都会是这1周目，也就可以总结来说，是我只玩这1周。这个世界相当于我的终极太空科幻虚拟人生。会通过各种行为，包括以后 mod 呀也好，自己做 mod 也好，建的哨站也好，等等，所有的这些足迹，去打造成那种终极虚拟太空科幻冒险人生。该死的银怎么找不到？这 bug， 我也有这个 bug。 没法解决，只能等修复。哎，这里有隐藏的洞里，不是很好找。用，我靠，从哪出去啊？我的天，迷路了，这边吗？这鬼洞，我总算出来。哎呦，这该死的洞鱼！我操，低体温症了，快点来救我，飞船！救人，不行了，冻死了呀 ！Come on！ 这里也躲不了雨。除了洞里也没有地方能躲雨啊。4个人都在外面淋着这零下200多度的不知道什么玩意液体。谁负责开的飞船？能不能再快一点？
I've found something for you. Pressure holding. Takeoff looks good.
Recalculating. And orbit stabilizing. Perfect.
《将做 VIP 勘探完毕，下一个。这星球怎么这么多行星？不是这个星系，这是 C， 而且它更离谱的是，这个波江座很宜居啊。它有一个黄金世界，首先，黄金世界波江座2，温和、标准氧气、平均、安全、完美。唯一你需要注意的是个病态生态圈和精神生物群，简称精神病生物圈。所以人要在里面生活的话，虽然自然环境没有问题，但是生态上你要注意注意。然后是波江座3啊，波江座4。波江座4虽然呢并不是天堂星球，因为它是腐蚀性的甲烷大气以及化学性的水，听上去很噩梦，但是它实际上有3种动物和3种植物，也就是说它是一个有生态的星球。接下来不仅有这么几个，而且它存在2个星球3个星球都有那个，你看这个甚至是波江座3 它也是半宜居星球。它虽然水是重金属，但是它也是温和，它也是标准氧气。而水这种东西，人类的技术肯定是能过滤的，所以它其实也可以称作黄金世界了。丰富的动植物，然后呢，2个黄金世界，还有很多有生态的星球，以及大量的同时存在水和大气的行星。这些水不一定是人能直接喝的，大气也不是氧气，但它依然有。它有很多这种行星。这个波江座真是一个宝地呀！我看波江座的位置呢也很宝地，它就坐落在离这个南门2不远的地方。可以看到它和这个就是南门2阿尔法、新亚、UC 首都离夏安星的距离，差不多就是波江座离南门2阿尔法的距离。他们3个，一个是 FC 的首都。UC 的首都，我觉得波江座这个波江星这个地方啊，很适合作为另一个势力的首都。想想以后要是弄个 mod， 把这里当做自己的根据地，然后我们不就达成了这个3点一线吗？这不正好是这个3点一线吗？多么完美啊！我刚才要到哪儿去？这儿。哎呦我去！这 ，shit！ 我这是倒了8辈子霉了是吧？我。回旋炮台，这个微软怎么总是抽风啊？这个 game 吧，在关键时刻。标在这里，直接撞过去了，这速度太快了。好。在这里好好的记载星球，突然出来烦人。C 雪，极寒。哦，化学。这什么东西来？绿硅烷。色。这是我们登记的第一个有色的行星，居然惊了。
Landing initiated. Watch your flaring.
Ah, my friend. Dish.
又正了这东西。极端环境低温，极端太阳辐射，收到。而我有冻伤和低体温症。冻伤和低体温症。零下219度。重力是多少来着？0.1。 嗯，怎么就一个人了？哦，吓我一跳，在后面，还以为是mod不好用。我操，怎么会有一种？这两种东西又找不到。色，绿呢？就差绿了。24天了，现在不是24小时，24天24小时。这绿不应该是稀有资源啊，奇怪。为什么我就是没有见到绿呢？绿这东西应该是比较常见的才对，不是吗？绿龟丸都在这里，绿呢？这件事非常神奇。我要去另一片地方看看，这地方有点怪怪，什么都没有。按啊镜头。 哎妈！完，点错了，又要来一遍。shit， 这，我。
I picked something up for you. Always a satisfying moment to return to your ship.
All thrusters firing.
Maneuvering into position. All clear. Time to land this ship.
Dude. 怎么可能这么难找？哎，这里靠，这狗屎运，哼，这运气，直接结束。
I have something for you, Captain.
Time to join the stars.
这个星球完成。
Orbit locked.
接下来
Just look at that view. 稀薄氮气还有水。对，还是安全。经。
沙漠山丘。
Everything checks out. Landing initiated.
So word is you're an executive now.
白天做买卖，晚上狩猎怪物。是他妈总裁，我才不是总裁。极端环境低温。零下195度。10乘5，哇！这直接齐了，靠！门口直接齐了，可还行？全直接安排好，如此便捷的吗？那看来我今天能把波江星探完。
Ship's ready. Any start. Orbital pattern locked. Easy.
Hailing unknown vessel. Colonists here in distress. Please. Thank you for responding. We're with, but our. We're just. We have a workbench, then we should be able to jury rig. We'll pay loads more than the. That should do it. We'll be heading out, hopefully.
截图，这是拍了还是没拍？拍了没放。最后一颗了，就是9号。今天正好能结束，非常完美，完美的一天。今天如龙7也通了，波江星也探完了，简直是非常的满足。但是我们还有90个星系呢，加油吧！哈哈，这才哪到哪。万事计划要是这么好完成的，还怎么叫万事计划呢？它之所以叫万事计划，希望没有传来烦我登录我的数据。我只是想默默在这里登录我的数据而已。 How? What the fuck? 你是不是有病？我说什么来什么是吧？人家他妈的在那里，真的是，哎呀！你来吧，你灭！ 我的炮台在侧面，这就是为什么我要侧着。这炮台在正面打不了，它是打后面和侧面，所以需要用推进器侧身去接近它。 现在安全了吧？安静了吧？有一个很大的问题 ，Notion 它这个排列不按照罗马数字排，它1、2、3、4，然后 IX 了 ，IX 明明是9的意思，但是它把它塞到4和5之间，这就没办法。 不智能啊！你应该能检测到这是罗马数字才对啊！喂，我也不知道我怎么自己调这个东西。只有水和泥。 简称不毛之地，毛都没有，鸟不拉屎。但是本着科学的精神，我们还是要下去。我们要踏足每一颗行星，对吧？这是肯定要干。我的天！ 我从这下吧，靠！这帮人全站那里，你们想干嘛？零下225度，极端环境，极端太阳，否。这个我要去看看，这两个标志为什么在一起？ 等等，我想起来，但是我还是去一趟，算了。来都来了，确认一下总没有坏处。这个我记得没错倒是。波江座，这星等，你看这些星球叫波江座但是这个星系叫波江星。哎，这行吧？那我看看别的那些是不是一样的呀？你说，比如说这个什么卡普坦星，里面叫什么呀？卡普坦1号星。那这个什么天征就叫天征，哎，那为什么这个是天江座、天江星啊？什么意思？为什么两？哎，我也不懂，我也不知道为什么有两个，反正是一个。OK， 今天的任务结束，我们要离开这个波江星。波江星勘探完毕，记载完毕，归档完毕。Shit， 真他妈热闹，走都不让走。我操！别叫了！星连井，这地方怎么会是星连的？我靠，我惊了！这个地方其实这个地方不是星连，星连也就是来这个地方是没有从属的，不属于任何的那个组织的。其实，为什么没完成勘察呀？哎，我操！我漏了什么吗？哎，这 IV 漏了，我靠！惊了，怎么还能漏的呀？这种有一点科学精神吗？我想不到这种东西还能漏。按理说是一个个过去的。不知道什么情况，好吧，差点。0.14寒冷。 有装不。
Beginning landing cycle.
现在0:52分。
A little extra excitement, eh?
啊？没有可呼吸大气更刺激了，刺激什么刺激？靠！你这个是不是有点离谱了？我等会儿在月球旁边待命，因为我要改船加上搓框架。明天啊，下次玩的话，明天不一定。明天是天际线2，后天是模拟人生4，然后是星空，天际线2，模拟人生4，星空，天际线2，模拟人生4，星空，天际线2，模拟人生4，星空。所以下次玩星空是后天。我们是这3巨头轮换了，3巨头每个都是成百上千小时的怪物，真的受不了了。你说哪来那么多时间玩这帮游戏啊？喂，这帮怪物真的。我只能给自己列一个这样子的时间表，否则我根本就玩不了这3个游戏，因为它每一个都是那种理论上有尽头，但实际上玩起来感觉不到。就理论上你肯定能参透所有系统，把所有东西都研究一遍，但是感受就是有点不现实。所以要是盯着一个玩，这一个就能玩很久很久很久，就别想玩别的。所以你有2个选择：一，你一直玩这款游戏，直到你说我彻底玩够了，我再下一个；要么就只能像我一样，我都很想玩，那我就只能说我今天玩这个，明天玩那个，后天玩那个，而且是强制执行。就是我这种玩法的话，你会发现每一天啊，你都想玩前一天的游戏。比如说明天我回到家，我就想玩星空，但是不行，我给自己定了，明天我要玩城市天线2。然后后天你坐到电脑前，你就想玩城市天线2，不行，我要逼自己必须玩模拟人生4。大后天坐在电脑前，哎，你就想玩模拟人生4，但是我要逼自己玩星空，每一次都是这样子。但是我发现这种方法非常奏效啊，就是在这个切换游玩能多多体验这件事情上非常有用，特别是在现在这个时间很宝贵的这个时期啊。OK， 现在是完事了，我们可以溜了，我直接溜了。现在这个我们开到月球轨道上就行了。
We're clear.
We're locking into orbit
To the
now.
moon. To the moon. 我要顺着自己的意思改时间表，就会变成我之前说的那个样子了呀，就会变成比如说今天玩星空，明天我要玩星空，后天我要玩星空，然后就但是我就是太不规律了，我觉得那样子，我还是想比较规律一点。然后你比如说玩了个10几天星空，你突然想，哎，今天我想玩天际线2，你开始玩天际线2，但是你又收不准，我觉得我还不如说每天呢，我还不如这样每天切换。这3个就轮回。这个地方登记了吗？火流星雨，这是它的唯一特质。啊，法国是，我忘了登记。我忘了登记温度， 我要下去一下。啊哦，我全忘登记了，哈哈哈哈！我来了，我又走。
Gearbox green, ready to land.
负18度，什么危害都啊有极端太阳辐射，才零下18度啊，只有一个极端太阳辐射，极端太阳辐射 ，OK， 这就是整个波江，应该改名叫波江星，波江星。整个这个波江星的这个资料，已经全部登记在案，完美 ，OK。
I have something for you, Captain.
This never gets old. Lift off. Orbit locked.
前往月球，波江做100%了。这个100%可不只是普通勘探，这个100%是整个图鉴全收录啊，所以看着非常有成就感，不是一般的上去扫2下就好了的那种。现在回家，月球。好久没跃迁了，因为一直在这里待着。这不是，对，干嘛呀？只是个提醒啊，搞了半天。你搞吓我一跳，靠！
Tired of that?
OK 了，就停在月球轨道这里。我们今天就到这儿，拜拜。